Long ago, God commanded us to remember the Sabbath because it would be forgotten. But God never forgets, and along with preserving His Word, He also preserves historical knowledge so that we can confirm His Word as true. Today we're going to go on an epic adventure through time to see a very important and profound revelation, that there's been an uninterrupted 7-day cycle since the beginning, and that means that the seventh day has always been the seventh day. Welcome to the show, everybody. You're listening to the Dance of Life podcast, and I'm your host, Tudor Alexander. Welcome to this very interesting, hopefully very interesting episode. I think it will be very interesting, especially for those who are hungry for the truth. I've spoken about the Sabbath many times in many places and in many ways, and today I will hopefully make all of those instances in other places even more meaningful. Even more meaningful because the seventh day that we rest on is the same seventh day from the very beginning. It's the same seventh day that God rested on after He created the world. And it's the same seventh day that Jesus rested on after He redeemed the world. Despite wars, despite satanic activities, deceptions, upheavals, God has preserved crucial pillars of reality so that His elect, His people, always have a guide, always have guidance. They can always learn the truth. He has preserved His Word. We know that. The message of the Bible, despite all of the upheavals of history, has been completely preserved. God has also preserved historical knowledge. Obviously not everything, because the devil is also in the world and certain things have been hidden. But we have enough to confirm God's Word as true, and that's what matters. Very, very important. With that in mind, today is going to be a correction to something that I have spoken about before regarding the Sabbath. In the past, I covered the history of Saturday and Sunday, especially my Sabbath series, the various calendar changes, the many historical upheavals that have happened over time. In my Sabbath series, there's an episode on debunking the lunar Sabbath. It's a very long episode because it also talks about God's true calendar, which is a very complicated discussion. But I talk about that and how the sun, it has a position in the constellations throughout the year, and those are the 12 divisions of the year all the time without any intercalation. It's a very, very interesting system. The moon is a second witness, and so on. And obviously that system disappeared very quickly, especially after Babylon. But either way, just a little footnote there for those who believe that the moon is how the Sabbath is reckoned. You're wrong. Please watch that video and learn why the lunar Sabbath, which is a recent invention of men, even the Jews didn't believe in such a thing. Please learn why it's wrong, because the Bible commands you to rest in a 6-to-1 ratio. So 6 days you shall work, 1 day you shall rest. You don't get that by using the moon, nor is the moon ever prescribed as a way to measure the week, because the week is based on days, which are measured with the mornings. So a lot of people who keep the lunar Sabbath or believe in the lunar Sabbath also Judaize and believe in evening reckoning, which of course is an inversion. It's wrong. So anyway, it's another can of worms. But the point is that today we're going to cover this history of Saturday and Sunday in great depth, and the continuation of the days, because the lunar Sabbatarians, and even people maybe who don't believe in the lunar Sabbath, often argue like, well, how can you know it's the real day? There's been so many changes. And you're right, there have been many changes. And that's a fascinating thing, that the fact that despite those changes, God has preserved this knowledge. He's preserved the weekly unit, which is such a profound adventure that we're going to go on today. But this is a very nuanced topic. It's a very nuanced topic. It took me quite a bit of digging. I was originally under the impression from my first attempt at the research and work that I did on this, that we can't know when the original seventh day was. That was my original impression. I interpreted that as, well, it must be a test from God, because what the Bible actually commands is a pattern. All right, 6 days you shall work, on the seventh day you shall rest. So as long as you're resting on the seventh in a sequence of days, then you're honoring the pattern, and God allowed whatever the powers of the world to confuse the times so that it would be a test. That's the way I justified it to myself. If tomorrow they happen to change the order of the days and said that Thursday was the seventh day, okay, well, I guess that's what we're calling the seventh day. We're going to rest on that one. That was my thinking for a little while. I would say the last couple of years at least. However, what I've realized is something very fascinating. And that is that the seventh day that we have today, which we call Saturday, is actually the seventh day from the very beginning of creation. There has not been an interruption in that cycle. There's been interruptions in other ways, but there's not been an interruption in that cycle, which is a fascinating reality. There's very good evidence to support this, and we're going to be covering it today. It doesn't matter what the world calls that seventh day. In this case, the world calls it Saturday, Saturn's day. For us, it's the Sabbath. And actually, fun fact, in most languages, except English, Saturday actually has a connection to the Sabbath. Spanish is Sabato. You'll see actually in Arabic also there's a connection there as well. I know in Romanian we say Simbata, which comes from the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is definitely baked into language, which is very, very interesting. Another clue that the knowledge of this reality has been preserved. So Saturday is not just the seventh day of our calendar, it is the seventh day. And again, when I say Saturday, I'm just referring to it colloquially for us. There is no names to the days. If you want to be a true narrow road biblical Christian, God never gave names to the days. We use names as a convention to relate in the world, but there's only one named day, and that's the Sabbath. So for me, the seventh day is the Sabbath day. I say Saturday colloquially, but what I really mean is the Sabbath day. So that's our adventure today. Many have asked me how we can know this is the true seventh day, and today you're going to learn why or how that works. So make sure you subscribe, like, leave a comment of what you learned today, hopefully something productive, and share this with somebody so they can learn the truth, not only about the Sabbath, but that God is completely sovereign. He's sovereign over all of the shenanigans of the devil, of the enemy, of the human flawed way of doing things, that he has preserved what counts. He has preserved what matters. He's preserved history. He's preserved the weekly unit of time. He's preserved his word. He is sovereign. What a profound thought. If you want to support me, you can go to the website at danceoflife.com. You can be a free member there and just be on the email list. You can check out the merch store. You can get yourself a USB of all my content, or you can donate if you want or be a member. Now, a couple important notes. I'm going to put this presentation as an add-on to my Sabbath series. I'm going to put it in there. It's not going to be on the USB that you purchase right now. Of course, if you're watching this from the very far future, maybe end of 2026 or beyond, there will be another add-on USB. I just don't know when I'm going to release that yet because I'm waiting for all the information to compile because I want a fourth volume of Bible studies to be released. And that needs to be 800 pages. So whenever I get to 800 pages again, I'll be releasing these things. But this will be on the add-on USB eventually. So just an FYI. If these topics are new to you, please watch my Sabbath series. Please watch my Lord's Day series. There is over, 40 hours of content between those two series on these topics. And I'm going to be assuming in this conversation that you have some experience with these topics. So I'm not going to defend every single claim that I make in here. This is not a defense of the Sabbath kind of video. This is more an exploration through history, assuming that you already have some experience with this topic, because I've already defended my belief and beliefs about the Sabbath in many places. So with that in mind, what's the problem? What motivated me to make this presentation? Well, what motivated me as usual is curiosity. I get curious about something and I'm like, I start asking more and more questions. I had this nagging feeling about my position on the Sabbath issue with being the seventh day, even though it seemed biblically justifiable, because again, it's according to the pattern. Right? So I was able to justify it in my mind, but it nagged me. I'm like, would God lose track of the day or allow, he wouldn't lose track obviously because he knows everything, but would he allow humanity to lose track of the day? Would he allow the devil to change the order of the days? Like, would he not preserve the seventh day? That's something that really nagged at me. And of course, knowing who God is, it seemed that he would preserve the seventh day cycle, and the seventh day we're on is actually the seventh day of creation. But I had a conflict because of my original research, and we'll cover that today. In the Exodus, as I was studying the Exodus more and more, God reminded the Israelites of the 7-day pattern before Sinai. That's in Exodus 16, 22 through 30, which I did not link, but let's link it now. Here it is. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each, and when all of the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what Yahweh commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to keep until the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to Yahweh. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. So we see a breaking of the principle. So how does God react to this situation? And Yahweh said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" Keep that in mind when we get back to Abraham. But this is a commandment and a law already. "See, Yahweh has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. So all of this happened before Mount Sinai, which proves to you that the Sabbath is something that is set apart from the Mosaic covenant. It's something that happened before the Mosaic covenant. Of course, we know it happened in Genesis 2 at the very beginning, but as far as their relationship to Israel, it happened before the covenant. So it is apart from that. It is not part of the Mosaic law, as most people erroneously believe. But now the question is, when God reminded them of this day, the nagging question on my mind was, would God pick a random day and just say, okay, from now on, this is your 7th day? Or would he have kept track of the original 7-day sequence from the very beginning of creation? Because he's an infinite being and works everything according to the counsel of his own will, would he have timed everything perfectly so that they would end up in the wilderness on this particular day and rest on the 7th day and be reminded of this pattern that was created at creation? In other words, the creation pattern was set up first, and then Israel was grafted back in. Do you understand? Humanity entered the Sabbath as the first thing on day 7, and then they fell. So day 7 was resting with God in paradise as a product of the covenant that Adam had with God. The covenant was broken. Humanity, as a result, being represented through Adam, was disowned. And then, through successive covenants, which we'll talk about in this presentation, that covenant was renewed, and you will see that the Sabbath is part of that covenant every single time. And with the Israelites specifically, the Sabbath comes before the Mosaic law. So it's very, very interesting. So, in another presentation that I have, as the time of this video, when it's going to be released, when you're watching this, you're going to see another video that's coming within like a day or two of this other video. So if you're watching from the future, they're both practically released at the same time. However, today, when you're watching this, there's another video going to be out in like a day or two called The Last Decade, where I talk about this in depth. This is a timeline that I made with the plagues in Egypt. And it's very interesting because I realized, because of a few very key things, like the 7 days passing between the Nile being struck and that whole plague, and the interval of 7 days is used. And I'm like, that's really interesting. Also interesting is the fact that Passover happened on the 14th of the month, and this was the first month of the year for them, which means it would start with the first day of the month, which would be the first day of the week, which means that Passover fell on a Sabbath. The first one fell on a Sabbath. So when the Israelites were resting in their homes and Babylon, quote unquote, Egypt, was being judged, that was a picture of the gospel. It was a picture of the final judgment. And it was all happening on a Sabbath. So I started to do the math and really break this down. I'm like, this is really quite fascinating, because it seems there's two possible timelines, and I lean more towards the second one. But it seems that there are, like if I zoom in here, this is super zoomed, but there are 4 Sabbaths total. If you plot this out, again, I'm going to defer to my upcoming video as the time of you watching this. But again, if you're watching this from any point in time after that, then just go watch the other video. The last decade, where I go in this explanation in great detail. But these are the various plagues. And it seems to me, I think there's very good evidence that the plagues in Egypt spanned 4 Sabbaths. The little box outlines are when the Sabbaths happened and what day of the plague. There's 22 total days of the plague, and it spans 4 Sabbaths, with the first Sabbath being where they were doing the snake challenge with Pharaoh's sorcerers, and then Passover is the last Sabbath. So 4 is a biblical number, 7 is a biblical number, and this is all very interesting. And then you continue outward through this, and you go to other timelines, like this is the continuation. So if we go to the month of Abib, this is the 14th, and then they leave on the 15th. And you just do the math of what the text tells you, and it seems, again, that the Sabbath is playing a very key role, where they have the wilderness manna situation, and they do their first Sabbath, and then they have another situation where they're told to purify themselves for 3 days, and then God comes down, and that happens on a Sabbath, and then Moses goes up there and basically gets the 10 Commandments on a Sabbath, and then there's the 40-day period that happens, and that starts on a Sabbath, and then they come back. Moses comes back literally like a day or two before that. They're worshiping the golden calf. There's punishment, basically another punishment. And then there's a Sabbath for the people who were faithful, who entered God's rest after the judgment, after the bowl judgments, after the wrath judgments. You get it? Very, very interesting. A lot of typological things here that relate to the second coming of Jesus in the end. So anyway, I'm going to defer to that other video, The Last Decade, where I talk about these things, because this is in connection to a larger discussion on Jesus, I believe, will return on the Sabbath. So what is the point? Well, conclusion is that God obviously cares quite a bit about the Sabbath. He cares a lot about the Sabbath. He integrates it into various timings throughout history. There's a lot of judgments that happen on the Sabbath. And all of these things prove that God is sovereign over history, over time, over salvation, etc. We see the Sabbath timing at very key points in places like the Exodus, which means that it's very intentionally woven in and part of the plan. We also see that God reminded them of the Sabbath, which means that there was an already existing pattern, not something that he created willy-nilly again. God did not just create a day out of thin air and then give it to them. God had controlled and sustained the calendar and the sequence of things and timed it in such a perfect way so that Israel could then be grafted back in to life. The new year that was given to them and the calendar that God revealed to the Israelites was actually the true calendar. It's the calendar of life. It's the giant clock in the sky that you live in, and everything was timed according to how life works. It's very, very interesting. But he timed everything so that it would be a new year and a new beginning with the Exodus. And of course, all these are typological for the cross, the new beginning spiritually, and ultimately the final new beginning when Jesus returns and ushers in eternity. The first Passover was a Sabbath, symbolizing judgment for the wicked and rest for the believers, all while typifying Jesus simultaneously, because Jesus is the one who gives you rest. By the time Christ died in 31 AD, Passover fell on the 6th day of the week, so that he could rest on the 7th day in fulfillment of creation typology. I've also talked about how I believe, like I said, Jesus is going to return on the last day. So that means that it's not, the last day is not just a poetic word for, the final day of history, but literally it is the last day. It's the last day of the week, which is the last day, 7, completion. The Sabbath is the last day, and it's also the last day, if that makes sense. So all of these things weighed down on me because of a few problems. Problem number 1 is, did this pattern, which is the original creation week pattern, did it get lost by Jesus' time? And if so, what does it mean that he was resting on a different day than when he rested as God in creation week? What does that mean? Problem number 2, if Jesus rested on the actual 7th day, Did this pattern get lost or changed with Constantine? And all of the things that we know happened with Constantine and after Constantine with the institutional church. So in my Sabbath series, I cover research specifically about these Roman bath calendars that were discovered that are very old. I think they're from Pompeii and other areas, where the problem is this, folks. The problem is that they list Saturday as the first day of the week. So if we go to this website, this is one of these legalistic Torah-keeping lunar Sabbath kind of sites. But there's something on here that I want to show you as an example of all this. So here's, if I can zoom in, some of these websites don't exactly respond well to, this one's fine, it seems like. Okay, so where is it? Where is it? Here. Here's the calendar. Okay, this is a reproduction, it's a sketch, but these things have been discovered, and there's these like little you can see the astrological cycle, little sticks and holes, and there's the weekly unit. Here's Saturn, here's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Venus. Saturn with the sickle. So you can see the sickle in his hand. Oops, there it is. That's Saturn, okay? That's Sunday with the glowing head and everything. So this is the order of the week, the planetary week. But Saturday is first, which is really confounding. And pay attention to now what this says about it. Across the top are the 7 Roman planetary gods in order of the days of the week. The first day of the week is Saturn, who is depicted holding a sickle as he presided over agriculture and harvest. The second is Sol, crowned with rays of sun's light. The third is Luna, who is crowned with the crescent moon. The fourth is Mars, the god of war. Fifth is Mercury, wearing his winged helmet and holding a caduceus. Sixth is Jupiter, holding his thunderbolts. And seventh is Venus, the goddess of love. In the above image, the displayed date is Sunday, the 13th of May, which was represented by the astrological sign of Taurus. On March of 321 AD, Constantine relegated Saturday to the 7th day of the week, moving Sunday to the first day of the week, replacing Saturday. This is the problem. And this is what I went off of because every Sabbath-keeping site says practically the same thing. Prior to this, a Christian sepulchre dating 269 AD contained the following inscription citing dates from 2 different calendars. Now, pay attention. This is a very convoluted and nuanced topic. I'm going to try my best to make it as simple as possible. The equivocation here is saying that on 321 AD, that Constantine changed the calendar and he changed the order of the days. Saturday used to be the first day of the week, and now Constantine, with his edict, made it into Sunday to give it precedence, and now people are worshiping on Sunday, whatever else, right? Prior to this, in 269 AD, we can see an inscription of, a Christian inscription on a sepulcher, basically using 2 different calendars. Okay, it's true, they were using multiple calendars, but what does that mean? Does that mean the order of the days has been changed? It doesn't. But this is being presented to you as if the order of the days has been changed. In the consulship of Claudius Paternus on the nones of November, on the day of Venus, on the 24th day of the lunar month, Lucis placed this memorial to her very dear daughter Severa and to thy Holy Spirit. She died at the age of 55, yada, yada, yada. So he says the nones of November is November 5th, which fell on the day of Venus, Friday. This corresponds to the 24th day of the lunar month, which was the 2nd day of the biblical week. This usage of 2 calendars simultaneously and the transition from one to another is largely responsible for the lack of knowledge existing today regarding the Lord's true calendar. Remember, this is a lunar Sabbath site, so for them the true quote-unquote calendar is the moon. But folks, not even the Jews believe these things, okay? It's so easy. I can refute the lunar Sabbath with my eyes closed. So easy. So instead of refuting it with my eyes closed, I kept my eyes open, and I've talked for 6.5 hours on it. So go watch that video if you're being deceived by this. But nevertheless, another site, this is the Roman calendar. According to most Roman accounts, the original calendar was established by the legendary first king Romulus. It consisted of 10 months, beginning in the spring with March and leaving winter as an unassigned span of days before the next year. These months had 30 or 31 days, and they ran for 38 nundinal cycles, each forming a kind of 8-day week. 9 days counted inclusively in the Roman manner, and ending with the religious rituals and a public market. This fixed calendar bore traces of its origin as an observational lunar one. In particular, the most important days of each month, its calends, nones, and ides, like the ides of March, seem to have been derived from the new moon, the first quarter moon, and the full moon, respectively. So who's doing the moon stuff? It's the pagans. Anyway, to a late date, the College of Pontiffs formally proclaimed each one of these days on the Capitoline Hill. and the Roman dating counted down inclusively towards the next day of each month. For example, the year-end festival of Terminalia on 23rd February was called 7 Cal whatever. Anyway, the point is, here's the calendar, what it looks like, okay? This is a very convoluted and ineffective calendar that they were using. This is the festival 8-day week, market week calendar of the Romans. And we have a lot of evidence that they were using this. And they also had the planetary week with the stick calendar that you saw. So, conclusion. A lot of Sabbath keeping sites are like little mockingbirds. They parrot the same information from each other. And this is why it's a constant practice to walk a more narrow road in what you believe and constantly eat the meat, spit out the bones, reevaluate if you have to. It is true that the Romans had two calendars going on. They had the 7-day planetary week, and they had the 8-day festival market reckoning, whatever situation they had. In fact, they also had other things too, like segments, like invented months and like an undescribed, winter period. So it was calendation and calendars. When you get into that kind of topics, it's a very complicated area of history to study because people did not have, we take these things for granted. Like you look in your phone and say, oh, it's, this date. And, you have the time, right? You have that in the palm of your hand, whereas people didn't have that, okay? And keeping track of time was very complicated, especially because you wanted to be on track with nature and you wanted to be in line with the seasons and everything else. So everybody had their way of doing things. That's why when God rescued the Israelites, he revealed to them the true calendar, which is the sun's position in the constellations, the moon as a second witness, and, various things that we talk about there. Either way, it's true the Romans were using two calendars. It's true this makes reckoning much more complicated and history is much more nuanced and convoluted on this topic. That's true. However, the claim that Constantine changed the order of the days and that Saturday used to be the first day of the Roman Empire and then it went to Sunday, this is wrong. It's dead wrong, and I'll prove it to you today because the issue is much more convoluted. And this is the original problem. This is the original error that I made, that I was brought into, to be quite honest, because everybody says the same thing. And it bothered me. It bothered me that we couldn't know what day we were in, really, because I wondered if there was a continuation of the days, like with the Gregorian calendar. When the Gregorian calendar was instituted, there was no disruption of the sequence of the days. There was dates that were eliminated, but the sequence of the days was not shifted. And that got me thinking back to Jesus' time, and then from Jesus to Moses, and then from Moses back to Adam. So today we're going to unpack this. We're going to unpack this journey, and we're going to go step by step and see what history and scripture have to show us. This is a very nuanced topic with a lot of things to consider, but I hope that it will be a fascinating journey for you as it was for me. I believe there is very good evidence that the 7-day pattern has never been interrupted and that God has preserved it. There's certainly a motive to preserve it because it's essential and typological to the gospel. And that means very much so that our practice of the Sabbath is even more meaningful, which is what this all is about. If, when you rest on the 7th day, you are actually in alignment with the original pattern set by the Creator, that's even more meaningful. So that's what this is all about. Now, modern day to Constantine. A lot to talk about there. The last major change to the calendar was done by Pope Gregory XIII, and that affected dates and intercalation, but it did not change the order of the days. If we go to the Gregorian calendar, this is on Wikipedia, it went into effect October 1582 following the papal bull Inter Gravissimas by Pope Gregory, which introduced it as a modification of and replacement for the Julian calendar. The principal change was to space leap years slightly differently to make the average calendar year 365.2425 days long, rather than the Julian calendar's days of 365.25 days, thus more closely approximating the 365.2422 day tropical or solar year. This is, by the way, why the only way you can ever have a true calendar is by using the sun's position in the constellations. There are always 12 constellations dividing the sky, and the sun's position, the sun's movement is irregular. It's not an even 365 days. And the only way that you get a true calendar is by using the sky. Otherwise, you reveal that it's not the true calendar. There are so many calendars out there, Enoch calendar, Hebrew calendar, Zadok calendar, a lunar Sabbath, whatever reckonings. There's so many calendars, and none of them account for the problem of intercalation. There's only one that does that, and that's the original calendar that I discuss in my Sabbath keeping, lunar Sabbath debunking episode. The rule for leap years is that every year divisible by 4 is a leap year, except for years that are divisible by 100, except in turn for years also divisible by 400. For example, 1800 and 1900 were not leap years, but 1600 and 2000 were leap years. There were also 2 reasons to establish the Gregorian calendar. First, the Julian calendar was based on the estimate that the average solar year is exactly 365.25 days long, an overestimate of a little under 1 day per century, and thus has a leap year every 4 years without exception. The Gregorian reform shortened the average calendar year by 0.0075 days to stop the drift of the calendar with respect to the equinoxes. Second, in the years since the First Council of Nicaea, 8325, the excess leap days introduced by the Julian algorithm had caused the calendar to drift such that the March equinox was occurring well before its nominal 21 March date. This date was important to Christian churches because it is fundamental to the calculation of the date of Easter. To reinstate the association, the reform advanced the date by 10 days. October 4th, 1582 was followed by Friday 15th, October 1582. So you added a couple of days. In addition, the reform also altered the lunar cycle used by the church to calculate the date for Easter because astronomical new moons were occurring 4 days before the calculated dates. Whilst the reform introduced minor changes, the calendar continued to be fundamentally based on the same geocentric theory as its predecessor. The reform was adopted initially by the Catholic countries of Europe and their overseas possessions. Over the next 3 centuries, the Protestant and Eastern Orthodox countries also gradually moved to what they called the improved calendar, with Greece being the last European country to adopt the calendar for civil use only in 1923. However, many Orthodox churches continue to use the Julian calendar for religious rites and the dating of major feasts, which tells you, by the way, that Orthodoxy is a harlot of Rome, not the other way around. If Orthodoxy was the true church, then why does she cling to practices of the Roman Catholic Church? To unambiguously specify a date during the transition period in contemporary documents or in history texts, both notations were given, tagged as Old Style and New Style as appropriate. During the 20th century, most non-Western countries also adopted the calendar, at least for civil purposes. So this is not a conspiracy that happened. This is something that had to happen because the Julian calendar was just not effective. It was leading to intercalation problems. And the Orthodox still have issues with it because they're stubborn and they go by way of tradition instead of, getting something that is more effective. So Pope Gregory the 13th in Europe had been Christianized. Prior to Pope Gregory the 13th, Europe had been Christianized, obviously, because the Roman Empire became Christian, especially after Constantine. So Constantine, therefore, is the next major inflection point that we need to look at. Oh, by the way, this is a graphic. I forgot to show you this. This is a graphic. This is what it looks like. So in 1582, October went from October 4th, which is a Thursday, to October 15th, which is Friday. The sequence of the days did not change. It's the dates that changed. So that's the important thing to understand. So this was the last major inflection point. The one before that was Constantine, because Europe had been Christian. They'd been using, the Julian calendar and basically all the Roman reckoning that was going on. And so that's the next point that we need to look at is Constantine. Now, Sabbath-keeping websites claim that Constantine changed the order of the days and made Saturday the 7th day of the week. And this is not true. It's not 100% true, at least. There's some truth, but even so, it's not really the way they're presenting it. What happened with Constantine is actually very nuanced, of course, as usual. So we need to understand some important principles before we talk about Constantine. So we need to look at things leading up to Constantine so that we understand properly what actually happened. Now, Jewish practices. The Jews were known by people around them for their Sabbath keeping. Obviously, that was a very Jewish thing, which means that the 7-day pattern was very Jewish. And they were very strict in keeping records of the 7-day pattern. because they wanted to obey God. Obviously, a lot of them were also rebellious, but nevertheless, they kept track of it because this was integral to Jewish life. This is documented in many places that the Jews were very, concerned with the Sabbath. A couple of examples are, where is this thing here? Oh, okay, here we go. So this is Roman History by Cassius Dio, volume 7. So you can look at these up. Where is it at? Where is that? Page 271. We're going to go to page 271. So this is a Roman historian, he's a pagan, but he says, thus was Jerusalem destroyed on every day of Saturn, the day which even now the Jews reverence most. So for their rejection and for their constant rebellion, God sent the pagans to them on Saturdays, on the day of Saturn. Why? Because they were hypocrites. They were keeping the Sabbath, but they were actually being, rebellious to God in other ways, or some of them were breaking it. All sorts of things. So a lot of these judgments happened on the Sabbath. In fact, the destruction of Jerusalem, both times, the temple, both happened on the Sabbath. So very, very interesting. And this is well documented in history. Another one is, this is a site, I think this is like one of these, what do you call it? Sacred name type sites. But, they eat the meat, spit the bones. Some key historical references. 63 BC, Roman historian Dio Cassius, which we were reading about, described Pompey's siege of Jerusalem, noting Jews refrained from work on days of Saturn, enabling the Romans to attack on those days. Josephus calls them the seventh days. So during, before Jesus, the Romans were attacking the Jews on Sabbaths, which is a very important point. That proves to you, by the way, now the Romans were calling these days of Saturn because their 7-day pattern, the way they labeled days, aligned with the Jews' Sabbath. So Saturday, Saturn's day, for the Romans, aligned with the Jewish Sabbath. That's what they called that day. But for the Jews, it was just a Sabbath. But the fact that the Romans testified to you that every Saturn's day they were being attacked, that tells you that there was a regular, uninterrupted weekly pattern. The Jews were not using the moon to calculate the Sabbath because the moon is irregular. And that leads to various problems. For example, you'd have more than 7 days between 2 days, or you might have 2 Sabbaths in a 7-day period. That's one of the easiest rebuttals against this stupid lunar Sabbath thing. Anyway, history is very interesting. 37 BC, Dio Cassius records Jews performing religious rites on the day of Saturn. 30 through 26 BC, Latin poet Tibellus and Ovid mentioned the sacred day of Saturn, a day observed by the Jews. Frontinus and Dio Cassius note that the destruction of Jerusalem occurred on the day of Saturn, which the Jews revered. This is now 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. Tacitus refers to the Jewish Sabbath and associates it with Saturn. Justin Martyr calls the day before the crucifixion, the day of Saturn. Tertullian compares Christian. This doesn't make sense. Justin Martyr calls the day before crucifixion the day of Saturn. That's not true because he was crucified. The day after the crucifixion would be. I think that's a misspelling. The day after the crucifixion would be the day of Saturn. Tertullian compares Christian Sunday rest to Jewish Saturday rest. Dio Cassius describes Jewish reverence for the day of Saturn, and 400 BC, 400 CE. Or AD, I should say. Augustine argues the name Saturday does not make the Sabbath pagan, and the Sabbath remains the biblical seventh day of rest. So the point is this, that there's a continual pattern of 7-day keeping, especially for the Jews. That's very obvious. That's commented by both Christians and pagans that we can see. So the Jews were very meticulous about reckoning the 7-day pattern, and that was unique to their culture. Every day of the week is related to the Sabbath day in the Jewish culture. You had the first day of Sabbath, second day of Sabbath, etc., etc. And this was unique because you don't have a 7-day pattern without the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the interruption that makes the cycle continue. Otherwise, you just have ongoing days, and whatever division you're making is arbitrary. Does that make sense? So the Sabbath is the thing that actually creates the week to begin with. It's the interruption. And pagans would have no reason to do that. Otherwise, you have other periods, of course, that pagans saw, such as seasons, festivals, of various, natural phenomenon, things that the moon does. And you see that in other pagan cultures. But the 7-day pattern where you have a weekly day of rest is unique to Jewish culture and, of course, the Bible. It is a distinct thing that identifies the Creator God and separates the people who worship that God from the world. It is not related to natural cycles. It is on purpose designed as separate from all of these natural cycles, because the only way that you would infer it is by being in a covenant with God. Do you understand? Like when the sojourners would come to the Exodus and God commanded that, they're not going to be doing work. You're going to invite them. You're going to graft them in through the Sabbath, right? So they would learn of God's rest and, ideally repent and believe, right? Become one of Israel. So this is the point. So the Sabbath, there'd be no way for you to come to the conclusion that you would rest every week. That's a nonsense idea for the pagan who is synergistic, who needs to work every day, whose gods cannot provide for them, and so on. So this is a very interesting situation. So this pattern is distinctly biblical, and it's distinctly connected to the Jews in prehistoric times before Jesus, and the Romans are documenting it well into the church age. The Christians are documenting it. So there's a consistent, uninterrupted weekly pattern that the Jews are keeping. Okay, now Roman practices. Romans had two major ways of reckoning. They had the planetary 7-day week, and they had the festival calendar, which is the market weeks, the 8 days, our 8-day market weeks that were rotating, all those things that we looked at before. The 8-day market week thing was very disorganized, very terrible. Eventually, it fell out of style, especially by Constantine's day. This is another reason why the 7-day system just eventually was adopted and made sense. The planetary week was based on the visible luminaries in the sky: the sun, moon, Mars, Mercury, Venus, Saturn, Jupiter. There's also two major theories as to the origin of the planetary week. Either it came up naturally, or it was influenced by Jewish practices, because remember, the Jews were there alongside Babylon, alongside Persia, Greece, Rome. They were there the whole time. So there's some crossover that people have theorized, but we'll talk about these a little bit later. So you have the Roman practices with their two calendars. You have the Jews and their continual 7-day reckoning that people continually refer to. It's always on the day of Saturn, whether it's, 100 BC with Cassio, whatever his name was, all the way through, Constantine. It's always on the day of Saturn. Very interesting. Okay, now a third thread that complicates all of this is Christianity. Now, I have a 17+ hour series on the Lord's Day and all of the shenanigans of Satan in the first 400 years of the church, and how there were many things that happened to reinterpret the day of rest from the 7th day to the first day, to reinterpret. There's a lot of nuanced history that goes into the first few centuries of church history, especially on this topic. But Christians around 160 AD, approximately, started to explicitly refer to Sunday as the Lord's Day. Before that, they didn't. And people will point to John and the Didache, which were around 90 to 100 AD. But my argument to you, that I've talked about in other places, is that when they say Lord's Day, they actually mean the Sabbath. And that was changed. That was changed very quickly into Sunday. And again, there's other places where I talk about that, but that's besides the point. You can refer to those situations. The point is that by Constantine's time, the practice of calling Sunday the Lord's Day was pretty solidified. And you had councils, even like the Council of Elvira sometime before the persecutions were over, but they were warning Christians not to Judaize, and basically already you start to see the pressure on Christians to align with this perception and the redefining of when Christians should rest, when is the actual Christian day of worship, that kind of thing. Obviously, these things took even more centuries after Constantine to ensconce in the culture and to establish, but nevertheless, even by Constantine's day, this was a far-reaching practice, is to start seeing Sunday as the Lord's Day and calling it that. However, despite that, these changes and the reinterpretation of the Sabbath did not change the order of the days. There was a consistent sequence of 7 days. Remember that the first Christians were Jews, and that means they kept the Sabbath. And again, I have a 17 plus hour series showing you that the church as a whole, over time, obviously it decreased, but as a whole, it kept the Sabbath well into the 1100s in different pockets. And very early on, obviously, most of the church was keeping the Sabbath because they were Jews. So that's something to remember. The early church was very particular about keeping the 7-day pattern because they were Jewish, and people knew and continued that knowledge through time. Eventually, because of countless pagan converts, Gnosticism, Jewish persecutions, Roman persecution, etc., the culture was reshaped and the demographics were changed, allowing the reinterpretation of the Sabbath to come through, which is to rest on Sunday eventually, and to treat Sunday as the Christian day and eventually the Christian Sabbath. So the weekly cycle wasn't reinvented throughout all of these shenanigans. It was the perception of what to do on which day that was reinvented. And that took a lot of time. But the weekly cycle was there every single time. So by Constantine's time, the 8-day market week was still being used, but it was falling out of style. And the planetary week was also being used widely in the Roman Empire. It became very popular and honored, obviously, the planets as gods, and they were polytheists. So it was very popular. Now, parallel to this Roman system that was overarching everything, you had the Jews and the Christians. And both Jews and Christians kept the Sabbath. Okay? The Jews were very particular about it, even though some of them were hypocrites or legalists. And the Christians were very particular about it, even though, especially by the 4th century, the discussion of how do we keep the Sabbath without being like the Jews was very much prevalent in people's minds. People were still keeping the Sabbath. But the question wasn't how to keep whether you should keep the Sabbath or not. The question is, how do we as Christians now in the New Testament interpret the 4th commandment? But you had two groups of people that were very much adamant about making sure they obey God with the 4th commandment. So you had the Jews and the Christians, and they were, on top of them was superimposed this pagan system of reckoning. So many Christians were keeping the Sabbath alongside with the Jews. Some of them were fighting with others about whether or not they should keep it, or how much, or how to what. They were legalist camps. It was a real mess, but nevertheless, everyone knew the 7-day sequence was being continued and uninterrupted. Others, obviously, were arguing very early on, like Justin Martyr, for keeping Sunday a little more sacred and holy and interesting. But everyone was talking about the same 7-day week. The Jews and Christians, despite their countless differences, they were referring to the same 7-day weekly pattern. That was the thing, because otherwise you would have evidence to the contrary, and we'll talk about that. Now, where the confusion is the following. There's 2 points of confusion. Number 1, the Roman planetary week was not a legal or official way of reckoning the week. It's just an astronomical organization, and we'll talk about that today. That's point number 1. So point number 1 is that this stick calendar that we're looking at is not the official order of the days. It's just a way to represent the 7-day named after the planets in a sequence, and you'll see why. Point number 2, Constantine did not rearrange the sequence of the days. He didn't. His edict elevated Sunday to a position that it didn't have before, where there was rest associated to Sunday. And alongside all of the other things happening around that time, where the 8-day market week was going out of style and the 7-day planetary week was going, the Roman Empire was becoming Christianized. Christians and Jews were keeping the Sabbath and keeping that regular pattern. Eventually, everything just fused into one system. So Constantine's precedence of Sunday didn't change the order of the days. It just made Sunday a rest day. And with all the other things happening, eventually those two things mixed into one system of reckoning, where you had the regular 7-day weekly pattern that was continuing, but now it had names for days. And Sunday happened to align with the first day of the week. And it was always the first day of the week, even though on stick calendars, you see it represented as the second day of the week. So let's talk about the Roman Bath calendars. The confusion is that on these ancient Bath calendars, you often see there the order depicted very differently. So again, if we go back to this picture, here's Saturn, here's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so on. So Saturn is depicted as first. And the question is, why? Why is he depicted first? Saturn is listed as the first of the planetary week, and he has prominence. And Sabbath keeping sites, and unfortunately myself, when I was researching all of this, interpret this to mean that the Romans had a 7-day week that began with Saturday as the first day of the week. And that day happened to coincide with the Jews' Sabbath day. And so you had like these two calendars that were kind of backwards with each other. But this is false. The issue is actually much more nuanced as usual. Because if it were true, then Constantine changing Sunday to the first day is him actually changing the order of the days, but this is not what happened. It's not what happened. So this order was more ceremonial, it was colloquial, it was astronomical, rather than some official way of organizing the week. Because remember, the pagans had no reason, folks, they had no reason to have a 7-day weekly unit. In other words, for us, we have a 7-day weekly unit with the Sabbath because that's the created order. The pagans named the days after the visible luminaries, but other than that, they don't have a reason to say, okay, this day is the first day, and this is the 7th day, and everything's leading up to. You get it? Like everything's just a rotation of days. So you could pick any day to be the first day in a sequence of days, because it's arbitrary. You're not structuring things around an objective point. The actual week is structured around God resting, which is an objective historical fact, which is also Jesus resting in the tomb. Very important. So these are objective historical truths set down by God, and therefore the week is a function of reality. It's not some man-made construct. But for the pagan, it is, and this is the nuanced aspect of this. The Romans had festivals and days of rest for their pagan holidays, but the concept of a weekly day of rest is just completely unique to the Bible and God. It's not at all, you don't see anything in pagan culture with that. So a pagan would have no reason to divide the days in a sequence, with one being the highlight of rest and so on. This happened with Constantine, with his edict, but before that there was no such thing. And before that, they just had labels for days. Every week was the same. People had no rest, only the festivals to look forward to, market weeks, whatever they were doing. So they kept track of the planetary day name. Today is, Mars Day, tomorrow's Jupiter. Oh, I'll see you on Venus Day or whatever. But it wasn't like they had a weekend or a Sabbath day. Okay? They kept track of the planetary day name, but their civil and religious calendars were based on other things. The market week calendar, the festival calendars, the seasons, the moon. It was all very complicated. So this is why this is much more nuanced. The Bath calendars that we discovered from like Pompeii or whatever else in the first century do not mean that Romans officially reckoned their civil calendar in the order in which appears on those Bath calendars. That doesn't mean that. And then suddenly that order was changed with Constantine and his Sunday law, because it's a astrological convention. It's a naming convention. That's it. It's a subjective astrological naming convention. So that's point number one, which is that the Roman Bath calendars do not show or do not mean that there is an objective civil calendar that's being reckoned that way. They're just a naming convention. Point number one. Point number two, Constantine. Constantine's edict has actually nothing to do about changing calendar days. There's nothing in his edict about changing any days. There's not. It only provides an allowance for rest, and that's not even for everybody either. It's not like a universal Sunday rest law. It's actually just for certain situations. This is from sabbathrest.com. The Roman emperors Constantine legalized Christianity in 313. In 321, he passed a law for the protection of Sunday as the day of worship and rest. The law stated, on the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in the cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. In the country, however, persons engaged in agriculture may freely and lawfully continue their pursuits, because it often happens that another day is not so suitable for grain sowing or for vine planting, lest by neglecting the proper moment for such operations, the bounty of heaven should be lost. So there's nothing in here about changing the order of the days, folks. There isn't. Constantine made no mention of the order of the days or reorganizing or relabeling the days. It's just a decree that on the day of the sun, which you at the current time, could that be the first day, the second day? What is it according to? Well, you'll find out that it's the first day of the week. It's always been the first day of the week. But they called it the day of the sun. And on that day of the sun, certain things can be allowed and certain things should not be done. Many Sabbath-keeping sites say that Constantine changed the order of the days. And the Jews basically just went with the new seventh day, which is Saturday. And so did Sabbath-keeping Christians. And, the rest is history. But this is wrong. This is a false narrative of history. That's not what happened. There was an already existing 7-day pattern that the Jews and Christians were aligning with very religiously because of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is what kept people on this pattern. Otherwise, you'd have no reason to keep track of the time. But if you have a commandment from God that he has hundreds of years of history punishing people for not obeying and judging people on Sabbaths, and you know that, then it's very important for you to obey that command and keep track of when to do it correctly. And by the way, even around that time, you even had the Romans doing their 7-day planetary week, which was already, like I said, by that point in time in the 4th century, the 7-day planetary week was starting to settle in, especially because of the influence of the Jewish and Christian communities, up and against and over the 8-day market week. Saturn, the day of Saturn, Saturday, is the planetary day name that happened to align with the Jewish and Christian 7th-day Sabbath from many accounts of Roman and Jewish historians. So the day that the Jews and Christians called Sabbath day, the 7th day, happened to align with the planetary name day that the pagans called Saturn's day. They just happened to align. And Saturday was basically that day. But Saturday was also represented as the first day in the Roman math calendars when we have these archaeological discoveries. So the question is, why? Why? Well, that brings us to the planetary week itself. The planetary week is an ancient concept in the pagan world because there are 7 major visible luminaries in the sky. Because everybody watched the heavens and believed in astrological alignments and astronomical situations. And they also worshipped these luminaries as gods. It was a natural thing to come out of the pagan mind that you should, name a day after every, if there were 8 visible luminaries, this is, again, shows you that God is sovereign. Because God, everything that happens is God's decree, okay? God decreed that there would be 7 visible luminaries that the pagans would interpret and create their own version of the week with. And then superimpose on top of the real week to give you a test. Very, very important. Because there could have been 8 luminaries. It could have been 9 luminaries. And the pagans would have said, okay, let's make a 9. You'll see with the way they came up with the planetary week, they would have had 8-day weeks or 9-day weeks. Paying homage to the 9 gods in the sky. But there's 7. Isn't that interesting? So that's God's design. But nevertheless, we know that people worshipped all the host of heaven. This is 2 Kings 23, verse 5. And he deposed the priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings in the high places in the cities of Judah and around Jerusalem. Those also who had burned incense to Baal, to the sun and the moon, and to the constellations and all the host of heavens. I believe KJV translates this as planets. Yeah, to the planets. The word there is like a derivative of the Mazaroth. It's like let's see, KJV plus. What does it say? It's Maza something. Planets, yeah, Mazalau. Can you see that? No, you can't. Let's see, maybe. Yeah, you can't. Mazalau. It's connected to the Mazaroth, which is a very interesting concept I talk about in my Lunar Sabbath episode. But nevertheless, so they were worshiping the gods, the false gods of the heavens with these various planets. So the idea of these 7 luminaries, being named every day, having a luminary, is just an old pagan concept. And because they were watching the skies all the time, pretty natural thing for them to come up with this idea and be deceived by it. Remember, this doesn't mean they had a strict 7-day weekly pattern where they said, okay, this is day 1, this is day 2, this is day 3, and then you have a rest day and so on. Because pagans on top of the planetary week, which is more of like a naming convention to label the different days, what they really had were festival calendars and things that were based on the moon, the agricultural seasons. They had a lot of different ways of keeping track of things. So this is the nuance, folks. The nuance is that the 7-day pattern for the Jews and later the Christians is directly related to their civil and spiritual worship, because God originated that pattern and their society was operating according to that pattern. The 7-day pattern in the pagan mind was just a naming convention to honor the various gods and to have a label for the days in a way to honor the gods. It wasn't a strict, unified civil week that people were using. It's not like it was the only thing. Today we have like months and days, right? We say, oh, I'll see you on Tuesday. Well, they had way more ways of measuring time, and their religious practices, it was much more complicated. So the 7-day planetary week was there, but it wasn't like this official, unified civil situation. Nowhere near as important and keeping reckoning of that, as the Jews and Christians did. Very, very different, but nevertheless superimposed on each other. So where did it come from? Well, it probably came from Babylon. If we go to Wikipedia again, this is planetary hours. The planetary hours are an ancient system in which one of the 7 classical planets is given rulership over each day and various parts of the day. Developed in the Hellenistic astrology, it has possible roots in older Babylonian astrology, and it is the origin of the names of the days of the week as used in English and numerous other languages. The classical planets are Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, and they take rulership over the hours in this sequence. The sequence is, here's the reason why there's the sequence. The sequence is from the slowest to the fastest moving as the planets appear in the night sky, and so is from the furthest to the nearest in the planetary spheres model. This order has come to be known as the Chaldean order. As each day is divided into 24 hours, 24 divided by 7 has a remainder of 3. The first hour of a day is ruled by the planet 3 places down in the Chaldean order from the planet ruling the first hour of the preceding day. That sounds really confusing, doesn't matter. The point is, a day with its first hour ruled by the sun is Sunday, is followed by a day with its first hour ruled by the moon, and so on and so on. So because they go in the sequence from the slowest to the fastest, and they assign, there's a mathematical way to basically make 7 names fit into 24, and so they have a sequence that they go by. That's what yields this order of the days, if you've ever wondered. Like if you go here, I know this probably looks like a satanic rune, but this is just basically the diagram. Here's Sunday, here's the first day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturn day, which is the 7th day. So Sunday is the sun, the moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. And this is the sequence that they followed according to the speed and whatsoever. So the order yields the order of the days in the planetary week. So, and then there's another one that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the abstract of this paper. This is a paper. How do I get rid of this, I wonder? There we go. This is a paper called Theon Hemerae, Astrology of the Planetary Week and the Cult of the 7 Planets in the Greco-Roman World by Ilaria Butragini, Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies, University of College London. Abstract. This paper looks at the concurrent spread of astrology on the 7-day planetary week in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean from the last century BC through the late antiquity. During this period, astrology became increasingly pervasive in all aspects of life among members of all levels of society. Astrology was not only a system of divination claiming to predict the future by observing the stars, it implied a religious conception of the world, its starting point being the faith in celestial divinities that were taught to exert an influence on the world. The sun, the moon, the planets, and other astral phenomena were understood as divine powers affecting the life and fate of human beings. In the planetary week, each day was named after one of the 7 non-fixed heavenly bodies of the universe, as it was known in antiquity: Saturn, Sunday, so on and so forth. In turn, the 5 planets and the 2 luminaries, the sun and the moon, had been named after the Greco-Roman gods, and goddesses, and were themselves regarded as celestial deities, following the Near Eastern tradition that identified the heavenly bodies with specific divinities. This chapter argues that the growing familiarity from early imperial times onwards with astrological concepts and practices, along with the use of the 7-day planetary week as a means of measuring time, contributed to the diffusion of astral beliefs and the cult of the 7 planets as weak deities in the Greco-Roman world during the imperial and late antiquity periods. So, we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but the point is that the Chaldean order of the planets is an arbitrary organization of these luminaries, and very likely it came from Babylon, which is interesting because that's where Daniel's prophecies start. That's where the intermingling of the people with Babylon starts, and that's where Judaism starts and the counterfeit and everything else. So very, very interesting. But either way, Babylon, and of course, Babylon probably got it from previous iterations and calculations from secret knowledge and watching the stars from all the continuation of empires throughout time, probably even before the flood. So either way, it's not entirely subjective and arbitrary because it is based on the movement of the planets and using mathematics to evenly distribute them over a 7-day sequence so that each day is devoted to a planet. I don't believe in planets, but let's just say luminaries. Either way, it's a pagan invention, and also it is a naming convention, which is an important point. It's a naming convention. Again, pagans have no need to number their days necessarily. As here's the first day of the week, here's the second day of the week. They have a reason to label the days according to the luminaries that they worship because they're polytheists, and then they could order those days in a particular day based on the way the planets move, but that's about it. The Chaldean order starts with Saturn because it's the slowest moving planet or luminary, but that was just an astrological naming convention. It was just a way to organize the day names. It was not a civil practice that people adhered to because they had a lot of other calendars that they were using to keep track of things that they were doing, like their religious practices, agricultural things, etc., etc. So it was just a naming convention, and when it was represented on those Bath calendars, generally it started with Saturn because Saturn is the slowest moving. If Constantine had changed the order of the days, or if the order of the days had been changed at some point before Constantine, we should see some evidence in pagan and Jewish and Christian manuscripts, but we don't. We would see things like documents where Saturn's day, shifts by 1 to another date. And then you have Jews and Christians complaining that the civil week is now off, quote unquote, from the sacred week, conflicting accounts between different regions keeping the Sabbath and interpretations falling a day apart, and basically having conflicts there, disputes between Jews especially on which day actually is the Sabbath because they were very meticulous on it. But we don't see any of these things. We do not see any of these things before Constantine. We don't, which means that there was no change in the sequence of the days, despite all of these things going on. What we do see is a consistent usage of the planetary week by the Romans, which expanded more and more and began to replace the clunky 8-day calendar situation. That 7-day planetary week aligned with the Jewish Sabbath and weekly unit and the Christian Sabbath and the weekly unit because they're the same Sabbath. And these cultures were converging more and more and more and more. Obviously, Constantine was a very important inflection point, but it's important to understand the conversions that happened before that. We see also church fathers and many Latin manuscripts assuming that Saturday is the Sabbath, that Sunday is the first day of the week, Monday is the second, etc., without any mention about calendar shifts or weekly interruptions. For example, Justin Martyr, very early on, he's in the 2nd century, refers to the day of the sun as the first day of the week because he uses it a lot to point to creation typologies and so on and so forth. Fun fact, Justin Martyr lived after the Didache. He lived, he was born, like a decade after the Didache was written. And he wrote lots of things about Sunday, and he was very Gnostic. He was very much against the Jews. And yet, not a single time does he refer to Sunday as the Lord's Day. Now, don't you think that if the Didache, which does say the Lord's Day, you have to gather on the Lord's Day, but it also says the day of preparation. So that's a Sabbath keeping term. If the Didache is talking about Sunday as the Lord's Day, which it's not, there's no such mention of Sunday as the Lord's Day in the Didache. It just says the Lord's Day. So you have to guess. But you don't need to guess if you know good history. The Didache is talking about the Lord's Day as the Sabbath. But if it was talking about the Lord's Day as Sunday, and Justin Martyr was very, very pro-Sunday, I mean, super Sunday keeper guy. I mean, he wasn't keeping Sunday as a Sabbath, but very much pro-Sunday as the Christian day, that this is the thing that we need to be doing. And he was very early on, but after the Didache was written, why doesn't he refer to Sunday as the Lord's Day? If that was something that had changed in the Christian mind, for him not to refer to it as the Lord's Day is very out of character with the world. Unless people weren't calling it the Lord's Day at that point in time. And the push to try to get it to be the Lord's Day was still being pushed. Because we see 50, 60 years after the Didache was written, in 160 AD, that people start to explicitly call Sunday the Lord's Day. But Justin Martyr doesn't call Sunday the Lord's Day, which is very out of character if John and the Didache both are pointing to some quick tradition that blew up immediately after the resurrection where people were calling Sunday the Lord's Day. Not true, because John and the Didache are calling the Sabbath the Lord's Day, because there's only one Lord's Day, and that's the Sabbath. Nevertheless, that's a tangent. The point is that Justin Martyr very early on referred to the day of the sun, Sunday, as the first day of the week. So people understood that, these things were the way they were. They were organized consistently, and there was no change in the sequence. There's no disputes recorded in the Talmud or any Jewish commentaries, any Mishnahs, Gemaras, whatever, which are very robust. I mean, obviously we don't believe these things, but they do document important history. And there's no squabbles between Rabbi Shlomo and Rabbi Steinberg about the day being actually moved over by one day. There's no such thing. There's no records, despite all of the dispersions, upheavals, revolts, Jewish revolts against the Romans, persecutions, and so on. And of course, the answer is there was no change, because the knowledge was preserved. Even if a few pockets maybe here and there may have fallen out of it, there were always robust records kept simultaneously by countless groups of people that could corroborate the truth. You see how brilliant God is, how he keep, just like with the manuscript evidence of the scriptures. We have so many manuscripts that corroborate each other that you can piece together what something said with very good accuracy. And that's brilliant, because God preserved his word through countless scribes and countless people, countless testimonies, so that it's like completely decentralized. Really, truly brilliant. So the same is with the sequence of days, sequence of time. These things were kept by many, many groups of people and corroborated. So the planetary week calendars are only one piece of evidence, by the way. They show an arbitrary arrangement of the gods, with Saturday as being first, and then Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. Remember that the Chaldean order is the order of the name days that we have today. So you could start with Tuesday, and you could represent a stick calendar on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. You could do that. So it doesn't matter when you start. The order is the same based on the Chaldean calculations. The question is, when do you start the week? The concept of starting the week with the first day of the week and having a seventh day that's the true seventh day is distinctly a Christian and Jewish concept, because that goes back to the objective truth that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. That is an objective measurement of reality. And so when you measure and you say this is the first day, you're appealing to objective reality. So that's really important. Some calendars represented this order, the planetary weeks, as Saturday being first. So again, what do we make of that? Well, what we make is that this was just an astrological naming convention. It wasn't a civil or legal system. If you want a lot of digging and detail on this, you can see people like Ilaria Butragini, the one that I just read, her paper. She's written a lot. Sasha Stern, also, he has a paper, I believe, called The 7-Day Week in the Roman Empire. There's also Christianizing the Planetary Week and Globalizing the 7-Day Cycle by Mark Anderson. That's in Volume 3, Issue 2 of Studies in Late Antiquity. You can read into all of those if you want. The 7-Day Planetary Week appears around the 1st century BC in Italy, approximately. About 200 years later, by the 1st century AD, it becomes standardized, and it's used quite across the Roman Empire. Again, astrologically, hence the Bath calendars that you see, where they're organized in a particular way. It diffused rapidly through Rome, in large part because of the Christian and Jewish influence. Because the Romans, again, remember, the Romans were using their complicated festival calendar, and they had the naming sequence of the 7 days. Meanwhile, among them were these Christians and Jews that were very particular about their 7-day week, and it seemed to go well for them. They weren't so complicated with all of these complicated schemes. So eventually, especially into Constantine's time, where the Roman Empire became Christianized, it became more and more reasonable to abandon this 8-day system and just do what the Christians and Jews are doing. So there's, again, this convergence of two systems. The Romans did not have a universally agreed upon numbering of the days. They had the Chaldean order, which gives you the order of the days, i.e. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so on. But when do you start the week there's no objective, name sequence of numbering them. Because of, again, the Christian influence and the Jewish influence and Constantine's eventual conversion and the compromising of everything and the unification of church and state, the planetary week names was superimposed on the existing 7-day sequence. And that happened to align with Saturday being the 7th day of the week and Sunday being the 1st day of the week. So what used to be a very loosely conceptualized pagan thing got tightened up by the scaffolding that was existing among them through the Jewish and Christian cultures. And the names of the days were fused with the existing creation week pattern that the Jews and the Christians were keeping, and you have the modern understanding of the week. This is consistent with the compromised church prophetically that we see in the third church, which is Pergamum, and other theological compromises that happened around that time, of course, and afterwards. The Jews had no names for days, and neither did the Christians, because, again, remember, the first Christians were Jews, and even, like I said, when Justin Martyr was writing his letters, even then, he wasn't calling Sunday the Lord's Day. The Christians, the early Christians, like apostolic Christians, called the Sabbath the Lord's Day. And that's it. That's all you had. You had a first day of the week, second day of the week, and then you had the Sabbath or the Lord's Day. Eventually, you had a name from the Christians for Sunday as well. So you had the Sabbath, and then you had the Lord's Day. That started to happen 100 plus years after the crucifixion and the New Testament was written. 100 plus years. Within 100 plus years after that, you have the naming of all of the days as the Roman Empire fuses with the existing Christian foundation. So it was a successive compromise. But in this series of compromises, the foundation, the cycle, the heartbeat from creation never changed, which is a profound revelation. So every other day had a number relating to the Sabbath for the Christians and the Jews, but only the Sabbath had a name. And that's important because the Sabbath, the name of something determines its importance. No other day was important because those are the working days. You had the preparation day, but the Sabbath is the day that has the highlight and the name, because that's when you get to rest, and that's when you enter God's rest and the gospel. Eventually, like I said, all the days had names, and this is the compromise that we live in today. Eventually, after that, we're fast forwarding quite a bit now to like the Industrial Revolution, where you had things like the weekend and other subversive things to basically hide the Sabbath and make it seem like the Sabbath is a working day. And I discussed many of these shenanigans in my Lord's Day series, how Rome basically made people fast on the Sabbath. And then once the fasting dialectic with fasting on the Sabbath was done, to basically make the Sabbath a burden. Then you start to see a lot of apparitions by the devil as Mary on the Sabbath, so that the Sabbath could then be consecrated to Mary. So once the fasting dialectic was done, dark, you have the light, the false light of the apparitions, and people are less the wiser. So why did the Sabbath intersect with Saturn's day? Why is there that intersection? Well, these were two parallel systems that just intersected organically. It wasn't a deliberate intersection. It just kind of happened. It could have been called the sun's day. It could have been called Mars' day. It could have been anything. It happened to be Saturn's day. Based on the Chaldean order, again, the order that creates based on the mathematics and the speed of the planets, you get Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You get that order. The Romans, again, remember, this started to be a practice in the 1st century BC. And as they're attacking the Jews and well into the 1st century AD, they're noticing more and more that every time the Jews rest on their Sabbath, they happen to align with the Roman day of Saturn. They just happen to align. These two cultures came into contact, and now they're noticing basically that the Jews were basically aligning their Sabbath with Saturday, or rather I should say that the Roman Saturn day aligned with the Jewish Sabbath. Of course, over the course of time, there were many polemics aimed at the Jews, making them Saturn's people. They worship the god Saturn. And of course, today people even believe many of these Roman psyops, and they say that Yahweh is actually Saturn or Satan. And they know some half-truths with the evils of the Talmud and Kabbalah, but then they go off into the deep end, and they believe that if you keep the Sabbath on Saturday, you're worshiping Saturn and Satan or whatever. So there's so many misinformative, deceptive websites out there and people. So I caution you to believe these types of things without investigating them. Of course, we try to be as narrow as possible here, but nevertheless, just realize that these stories are very old. The truth, as always, is much more nuanced and narrow. Either way, it happened to align, and eventually the two systems converged. But the order of the days was never affected. Now, Sacha Stern, who I cited previously, who is very widely cited on this issue, lays out two possible scenarios, and they're pretty simple. Either the Italians observed the Jews because of their contact with them and anchored their planetary understanding beginning with the Jewish Sabbath because it was regularly occurring, or they adopted previous systems like the Chaldean order and happened to notice the intersection of Saturn's day with the Sabbath. So in other words, either it was modeled directly after the Jewish practice of keeping a regular week, and they said, okay, we're going to give names to the planets, and these Jews seem to keep a 7-day pattern, and there's 7 planets, so that makes sense, so let's organize it. Well, it seems like, Sabbath would align with Saturday, so it was just a decision to align the planets according to the Jewish keeping, or this was an older practice that they had from Babylon, and they noticed there was an intersection. It doesn't really matter. I don't hold to either. I mean, I think either could be true. I don't have a particular preference. It doesn't really matter, because what matters in the end is that there's a continuation of days. That's what we're trying to prove. So it doesn't really matter how this system came about. I want to think, and I want to say that the influence of the Jews, and of course, obviously later the Christians, had a big part to play with this planetary week system and being adopted more and more into the Roman system. But who knows how it originally all came about. So, conclusion. From modern day back to Constantine, there was no change of the order of the days. The Gregorian reforms changed the intercalation and the dates, but not the 7-day order. Constantine's Sunday law was not about changing the calendar. There's nothing in there about changing any of the orders, but about declaring a day out of the week as a day of rest. By Constantine's time, you had 3 parallel systems. You had the Jewish and the Christian week, and then you had the Roman planetary week. After this decree, and eventually his conversion and the unification of Rome with Christianity, etc., the strict order of the days that the Jews and the Christians followed solidified and eventually gave a structure to the name sequences of these planetary weeks, and everything just aligned, and basically the names of the days were all named now. So you didn't have just the Sabbath or the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. You now had Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Sabbath or Saturn's Day, and Sunday or the Lord's Day. So you had lots of names that were influxed into the mind of the average believer. So the loosely organized concept of the 7-day planetary week took on a very definitive structure where Saturday was the 7th day and Sunday was the 1st. This order is the result of names being organized in the order of their planetary calculations, which is the Chaldean order, while being superimposed on the continuous sequence of the 7 days with the Sabbath as the 7th day. Because there is no evidence of calendar disruptions or changes before Constantine, that literally zero evidence. That means that the day that the Christians rested on in the 4th century, when Constantine was passing his various laws, is actually the same day that Jesus rested on in the 1st century. And by extension, our 7th day, the Saturday that you rest on, is the same 7th day that Jesus rested on with no disruption in continuity. But now, is there continuity between Jesus and Moses and the reminded Sabbath that was given to Israel in the Exodus? In other words, did the Sabbath that Jesus keep, is that the same Sabbath that Moses kept? And was there an unbroken line of continuation between Moses and Jesus, despite exiles, upheavals, apostasies, all of the things that you know that happened in the Old Testament? That's our next adventure. So, Jesus to Moses. We know that when God reminded the Israelites of the 7-day pattern, it wasn't this arbitrary thing, but rather inviting them into something that already existed. Again, he's grafting humanity back into a practice that was begun in the first week of creation as a part of the covenant with Adam and humanity. The question is, in 1,500 years of history, did that practice stay the same despite calendar changes, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, countless apostasies, and so on? Did that sequence of days stay the same? Also, the changing of the Mosaic calendar with the sun's positions in the constellations to one that's based more on pagan divisions of naming the months. For example, the word month in the Old Testament is chodesh. The problem, again, I'm going to defer to my video on the lunar Sabbath, is that chodesh doesn't mean month. The word month for us is an invented construct. The word chodesh for the Israelite mind in the Exodus was referring to a completely different concept, which is the sun's position in the constellations. And there's 12 chodeshim in the year. There was only one name, by the way, in that calendar for 1 month. Only the first month of the year, Abib. And really that name was more like the name of what it was doing, the month of barley sprouting for the start of the year. So you notice the same thing, that the Israelites were not given names for months. They were just given the first name. The first month had a name because that's the beginning. That's all you need to know. Once you know the beginning, then you can plot out everything because everything is regular, right? There's 12 segments to the year. There's, various full moon cycles and so on. So it's a clock. As long as you know the beginning, then you can know where the end is. Very interesting. With that said, once Babylon came around, you start seeing adopted month names like Nisan, Tishri, etc., from the pagan system. Sound familiar? Where they're adopting and converging these two calendars and making them basically into a kind of fusion. The reckoning of the months by the moon also eventually makes its way into Judaism. So did evening reckoning, I think, after 70 AD, because Jesus did not reckon by the evening. And that's easy to prove. But nevertheless, these things did come into Judaism more and more, especially after the Second Temple was destroyed. So a lot happened in 1,500 years with calendar changes, upheavals. 1,000 of those years at least was filled with rebellions, judgments, upheavals, calendar changes, and so on. Historically, we can follow the Jewish Sabbath practice back to the Second Temple period without any interruptions. We have very good evidence for that. There's nothing in Jewish records about calendar interruptions because they kept very meticulous records, and everyone knew when the Sabbath day was happening because it was central to their religious life, especially in the Old Testament. Before the Second Temple, we have to rely predominantly on the Bible's narrative to understand if there's continuity or not. And of course, the Bible presents you with a very continuous narrative throughout time. So let's look at the biblical narrative. In Genesis, you see the pattern established, Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So this is the pattern that is set up. The first pattern, this is an objective truth that happened. It's based on what God did, and therefore this is the objective numbering of the days. The seventh day is the seventh day because it's related to what God did. Very interesting. Fast forward to Exodus 16, where we see the manna incident in the wilderness, where the manna is used to train the Israelites in the pattern of working for 6 days, resting on the seventh. This is again before Mount Sinai. Exodus 20, the covenant is written down, the 10 commandments are given, and the Sabbath is obviously one of the 10 commandments, very important to God. And it's also, by the way, the 10 commandments were given to Moses on a Sabbath, and I talk about that in my last decade episode. But the Sabbath is formalized in stone as a pattern that needs to be kept. Then you have the monarchical periods, the kings, the judges, and everything else. And of course, those are filled with lots of rebukes from different prophets for Israel breaking the Sabbath and for not keeping God's word. However, they never rebuke Israel for forgetting which day it is. This is an important point. So let's look at a few examples. Amos 8, verses 4 through 5. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale, that we may make the ephah small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell the chaff of the wheat. So these people are waiting for the Sabbath to be over so we can finally get back to business. They don't care, but they knew when the Sabbath was. The issue is not that they didn't know what the Sabbath. The issue is that they knew, and they couldn't wait for it to be over, or they weren't even keeping it, or whatever else. Jeremiah 17, 19-27. Thus says Yahweh to me, go and stand on the people's gate, by which the kings of Judah enter and by which they go out, and all the gates of Jerusalem, and say, hear the word of Yahweh, you kings of Judah, and all the inhabitants of the Jerusalem who enter by these gates. Thus says Yahweh, take care for the sake of your lives, and do not bear a burden on the Sabbath day, or bring it by the gates of Jerusalem. And do not carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, or do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy, as I commanded your fathers. So this day is that Jeremiah is dealing with is the same day that the fathers were commanded. So Moses, David, etc., etc. Same day. We have continuity. Yet they did not listen or incline their ear, but stiffened their neck, that they might not hear and receive instruction. But if you listen to me, says Yahweh, and bring in no burden by the gates of the city on the Sabbath day, but keep the Sabbath day holy and do no work on it, then there shall enter by the gates of the city kings and princes who sit on the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their officials, the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And this city shall be inhabited forever. And people shall come from the cities of Judah and from the places around Jerusalem, from the land of Benjamin, from Shephelah, from the hill country, and from the Negeb, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices, grain offerings and frankincense, and bringing thank offerings to the house of Yahweh. But if you do not listen to me to keep the Sabbath day holy, and not to bear a burden and enter by the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it shall devour the places of Jerusalem and shall not be quenched. Which, by the way, the destruction, again, remember, of Jerusalem and the temple happened both times on the Sabbath. So, very interesting poetic judgment. Ezekiel 20, 12 through 24. Oh my gosh, this is so annoying. Sometimes I can't click on it. Moreover, I have given them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies them. So the people that we're talking about now with Ezekiel around the time of Babylon, the Sabbaths that God is giving them is the Sabbath. It's the same Sabbath that Moses received. There's no sense of like, this is a different Sabbath, or you lost track of the Sabbath. I've given you the Sabbath. Yet, what's the problem? Well, they're not keeping it. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, but rejected my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. And my Sabbaths they greatly profaned. Then I said, I shall pour out my wrath upon them in the wilderness to make a full end of them. But I acted for the sake of my name, and it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. Now, really quick pause. The wilderness is in view, so this is even more of a point that when he says, I gave them my Sabbaths, we're referring to the fact that I gave Israel the Sabbath, and yes, that Sabbath has been consistently there, but nobody's been keeping it. You get it? So this is a continuation point from the wilderness until now. Ezekiel, we're dealing with Babylon, so you're dealing with 1,000 years of continuity. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. Moreover, I swore to them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land that I had given them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most glorious of all the lands, because they rejected my rules and did not walk in my statutes and profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols. Nevertheless, my eye spared them, and I did not destroy them or make a full end of them in the wilderness. And I said to their children in the wilderness, do not walk in the statutes of your fathers, nor keep their rules, nor defile yourselves with their idols. I am Yahweh your God. Walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules, and keep my Sabbaths. We're now talking to the children. Keep them holy, that they may be a sign between me and you. Again, covenant is related to the Sabbath. Keep that in mind. That you may know that I am Yahweh your God. But the children rebelled against me. They did not walk in my statutes and were not careful to obey my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. They profaned my Sabbaths. So the Sabbath was kept the same. The reckoning was kept the same. They just refused to keep it, or they were profaning them. Then I said I would pour out my wrath upon them and spend my anger against them in the wilderness. But I withheld my hand and acted for their sake of my name, and it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. Moreover, I swore to them in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the nations and disperse them through the countries, because they had not obeyed my rules, but had rejected my statutes and profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were set on their fathers' idols. Moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good, and rules by which they could not have life, and I defiled them through their very gifts and their offering up of their firstborn, that I might devastate them. I did it that they might know that I am Yahweh. Therefore, Son of man, speak to the house of Israel and say to them, thus says the Lord God, in this also your fathers blaspheme me by dealing treacherously with me. I think I read a little too far, but the point is, the Sabbath is the main issue. Of course, you also have Isaiah, like you look in chapter 56 and 58. And then, after all that period of prophets, rebuking, the monarchs and the monarchical tribulations that were happening, you have the post-exile period with the Second Temple, Ezra and Nehemiah, where you see that the Sabbath is still obviously in view and it's being reckoned. This is Nehemiah 13, 15 through 22. In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath. So he knew when the Sabbath was happening, and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on the donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? So the nobles knew that it's the Sabbath day. It's not like they were ignorant. Otherwise, these warnings would be meaning like, well, it's the Sabbath? We didn't know. We had no idea. We've been using this calendar. No, they knew that it was the Sabbath day. Did not your fathers act in this way? So we're dealing with history. And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing, remember, when did the destruction by Babylon happen? On the Sabbath. So they knew that God was judging them on the Sabbath. The Lord's day is the day of the Lord. Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. A lot of people think that this is evening reckoning. It's not. Very simple hermeneutic is that the latest time, or I should say the soonest time that Nehemiah could make this command, which involves people working to close the gates, is the evening of the sixth day. Why? Not because the evening is when the Sabbath starts. No, because that's the last point in time where people are selling. So they're cleaning up shop. The sun's going down. There's no lighting. So people are done. Right after they're done, close the gates. That way, nobody can come in the morning when the Sabbath is actually beginning and set up shop. If they come in, they're going to see closed gates. That's a very logical maneuver. Otherwise, if you're closing the gates when the Sabbath is moving, then you're working on the Sabbath. There's other reasons why, but nevertheless, if you read in context, what else is here? Up to 22. Then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. So people knew that the Sabbath day was happening. The nobles knew that the Sabbath day was happening. They had reckoned, they understood, they knew that God was judging people on the Sabbath, like the Babylonian destruction happened. They didn't want it to happen again. So these are all very clear clues biblically that there is a consistent narrative from creation through the Exodus, through the monarchical period, into the Second Temple. And of course, from Jesus to the Second Temple, we have a very good historical record that we can rely on, that there's a continuation of the 7-day pattern. The issue is never that people forgot which day it was. It's never that issue. The Bible never presents that issue. It never presents an issue of ignorance. It presents an issue of knowing that the day was the seventh day in the Sabbath, knowing what it was about, which is about entering God's rest, and yet refusing to enter God's rest. And that was a very serious issue for God. The people knew, and they chose otherwise. They chose to profane it. They chose to trade. They chose to do other things, idolatry, apostasy, whatever. The verses, especially in Nehemiah, only make sense if people knew when the Sabbath day was. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. And the Bible gives no hint that the 7-day pattern was forgotten or changed around or lost or whatever else. People kept meticulous records. Now, there's some other historical evidence that is very interesting. This is from Brill. This is a paper called The Sabbath in Judean Communities during the mid-5th century BC. And did I highlight something here? I think I just offers this as a resource. But the point is, let's read the introduction. The importance in the observance of the Sabbath in the Judean exilic communities has often been the subject of debate. Recent studies have argued that the exiles in the Elephantine Egypt observed the Sabbath, while the exilic Judean communities in Babylonia did not. Indeed, economic documents demonstrate that at least some Judeans engaged with business as usual on the Sabbath in Achaemenid-era Babylonia. So they knew that there was a Sabbath, but yeah, whatever. The call for the reforms described in Ezra and Nehemiah, with its references to Sabbath observance, reflects a changing approach to the Sabbath within the Jerusalem Judean community. Moreover, new evidence in the form of names derived from Sabbath among the exiles during the Achaemenid period, this is like the Persian Empire, seems to reflect a shift in the importance of the Sabbath within the Judean identity. Below, we review the occurrences of the name Shabbataya in archival material and explore possible parallel phenomenon in Elephantine and biblical texts, ultimately drawing a picture of the Achaemenid era evolution in the attribution of significance to the Sabbath. So, what's the point? The point is that there's newly discovered evidence, relatively speaking, that shows that these exiled Jews in Egypt were keeping track of the Sabbath day very meticulously. The issue is not whether people knew about it. The issue is that to what extent were people obeying? As usual, right? Notice, very importantly, God is sovereign. He sent his people into the heart of darkness as a test. He put his people right with Babylon. And of course, Babylon had no Sabbath day. So like, hey, let's do business. Let's do business. Little temptation. Come on, do business with me. It's a Sabbath day. Pretty soon people forgot. And all right, we'll do business. The Babylonian ones were compromising, although many pockets were keeping record. Of course, everybody was keeping record, but they were also keeping the Sabbath, is the point. So it was God's design to bring these people to Babylon and to have the cultures mix. It was God's design to do that as a test. Because the command says, remember, it's the only command that has the word remember in it. So, do you remain set apart? Do you honor what God said, or do you follow the influence of the devil and the world? The unelect Jews went the way of the world, and they did whatever. They just did business, they were trading, whatever. They forgot about keeping the Sabbath, even though they knew what day it was. The faithful Jews kept track of the Sabbath and kept it. It's no different today with the pagan naming of the days on top of the creation week. It's no different. You have two systems that converged by God's design as a test, because the world system, especially coming up very soon, is going to rest on a particular day. And the test is, do you honor God's word or not? Another piece of evidence, besides the Elephantine Egyptian communities, which were, I believe, sometime in the 5th century BC, something like that. But either way, you have 1st and 2nd Maccabees. You can read these in the Septuagint and the Apocrypha. These are historical books that document various conflicts during the 200 or so years before Jesus came. The Maccabees were a group that wanted to take control back for the Jews, back from the pagans, obviously. They were successful briefly through their various revolutions and reforms, but they weren't successful ultimately. They had many battles, and many of those battles happened on the Sabbath, as recorded by Roman historians, as a judgment from God for their various apostasies. The pagans would attack them on Saturday because that's when the Jews were resting. And of course, these things were allowed to happen by God as a punishment for their hypocrisy. Or sometimes they weren't keeping the Sabbath, they were, doing debauchery or whatever else. So all of these things are proving to you that there's a continuation of the weekly cycle. And these are extra biblical texts. These are historical proofs. The Dead Sea Scrolls, you can look into 4Q 319 through 320. They talk about a 364 day calendar divided into 52 weeks, where Sabbaths and festivals are mapped very specifically. This is a very big deal for them, for the Jewish communities there. Again, you can have your opinions about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm not super frothing at the mouth for them. I'm just saying this is another piece of evidence. How old these things are, who knows? There's certainly debate about that. The Book of Jubilees is another important one. It's not scripture, but it is historical, and it's written around 135 BC. It discusses God ordaining the Sabbath and then inviting Israel into that creation pattern at the Exodus, not making up some random day. So this supports the reading that when God gives them the Sabbath in Exodus 16, it's not like, hey, from now on, this is going to be your 7th day. He's not recreating reality. Rather, he timed everything perfectly and invited Israel back into this covenant through the Sabbath, which is a profound thought. What it means, which we'll look at in just a second, but it means that these communities of Jews who wrote the Book of Jubilees, they interpreted the Sabbath observance and the manna situation in Exodus 16 as a continuation of the creation week Sabbath. So historically, that's how the Jews themselves interpreted the beginning of this reminder of the Sabbath, as it was a continuation from the creation week. In other words, the Jews never saw a disruption of the 7-day pattern. And we don't see that anywhere in any of the Jewish text or commentaries or whatever else. But let's take a look at the Jubilees book. So this is the Book of Jubilees, chapter 2, verse 16 through 21. And he finished all his work on the 6th day, and this in the heavens and on earth, and in the seas and the abysses, and in the light and the darkness, and in everything. And he gave us a great sign, the Sabbath day, that we should work 6 days, but keep Sabbath on the 7th day from all work. And all the angels of the presence and all the angels of sanctification, those 2 great classes, he hath bidden us to keep the Sabbath with him in heaven and on earth. And he said to us, Behold, I will separate unto myself a people from among all the peoples, and these shall keep the Sabbath day, and I will sanctify them unto myself as my people, and will bless them as I have sanctified the Sabbath day, and to sanctify it unto myself. Even so will I bless them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. So covenant language very much attached to the Sabbath, very important. And I have chosen the seed of Jacob and from amongst all that I have seen, and have written him down as my firstborn son, and have sanctified him unto myself forever and ever. And I will teach them the Sabbath day, and they may keep Sabbath thereon from all work. And thus he created therein a sign in accordance with which they should keep the Sabbath, with us on the seventh day, to eat and to drink and to bless him who has created all things as he has blessed and sanctified unto himself a peculiar people above all peoples, that they should keep Sabbath together with us. So, there's another one. This is from Book of Jubilees and the Sabbath from Israel Bible Center. So, the summary points here say the following. First, the Sabbath's heavenly origin is affirmed not only in the sense that God issued the command, but also because Sabbath keeping is at the heart of heavenly life itself. This is a summary of the Book of Jubilees and how the Jewish perspective was seeing it. Second, the Sabbath comes as a covenant sign. God chose Israel out of all the nations and commanded her to keep the Sabbath. Israel and the Sabbath are forever bound up together, for Yahweh has sanctified them both. Third, capital punishment was to be administered to anyone who has violated the Sabbath or in any way profaned it. Fourth, Sabbath keeping was not primarily outward and superficial in character, but an inner duty of the heart. So this is how the Jews saw the Sabbath we're talking 2nd century BC. Fifth, the Sabbath was to be obeyed without any invention of man, fully and without any compromise or avoidance. This is very much appropriate to the lunar Sabbath crowd. Sixth, the weekly Sabbath was greater than any of the feasts of Israel. No Sabbaths, as the greatest of all feasts of Israel, ought to be overshadowed by other holiday activities that Israel's God also decreed. The feasts could not supersede the Sabbath. The only means to accomplish this is to order life according to the heavenly 364-day calendar. That's what I was talking about with the, what's it called? Dead Sea Scrolls. So anyway, that's not the real calendar, but this was a tradition that they were using, and it was very particular about the Sabbath, which means they kept track of the Sabbath, regardless of how many calendars they used. Seventh, sexual relationship, contemplating, talking about any business activity, or even drawing water was forbidden on the Sabbath. The prohibition list also includes taking a journey, farming, creating fire, riding of any kind of animal, striking or killing anything, catching a living thing, fasting or making war, etc., etc. Eighth, Sabbath keeping was to be characterized by joy and satisfaction. Ninth, only temple worship takes precedence over observance of the Sabbath commandment. So these things were very much part of Jewish life, obviously, and that means we have a lot of evidence of a continual reckoning historically. We're talking history now, not just biblically, for these periods. There's also payment receipt records from the 1st century that document the week, the day of the week, and the month, showing that they were reckoning the weekly cycle. Of course, in Hellenized areas, when you had the Greek-speaking language, they even had words like prosabbaton, in other words, the day before the Sabbath, the preparation day. So that's evidence that they were keeping these cycles very much on lockdown. Philo and Josephus, both are Jewish historians, Jewish philosophers, authors. They both describe the Sabbath as a weekly institution, often taken for granted by the Jews and therefore being judged, just like the ancient Israelites. But they knew when the Sabbath was. The problem, again, is not that they didn't know it, but that they knew and didn't obey. Philo especially, he was a Jewish philosopher, also connects the Sabbath to Creation Week and sees the continuity between the Creation Week and the covenant with Israel and being brought back into the Sabbath practice. So there's a continuation in the Jewish mind. There's no evidence ever that the Jews thought that God had lost track of time or that he started anew with Israel, a new seventh day. There's a continual seventh day pattern. Samaritans are another interesting piece of information because they split from mainstream Judaism, obviously several centuries before Jesus, but they also kept the Sabbath. And it's very interesting because Samaritans and Jews had a lot of tension, obviously, like the Samaritan woman, the parable of the Good Samaritan. If there had been a calendar reset or change or problem with the weekly reckoning, we should expect to see these two groups fighting over this issue because they disagreed on a lot. They hated each other. So, especially the Jews hated the Samaritans. So, despite their disagreements, they both agreed on the Sabbath, which is a very strong testament for centuries before Jesus that this reckoning was very consistent. So, conclusion, from Jesus to at least Babylon, we see a very easily proven continuous 7-day pattern despite countless empires and upheavals, which is truly profound. It's truly profound and shows you the sovereignty of God that he preserved all these things. This is testified to by the biblical narrative, which is full of prophets rebuking Israel and continuity, and also the historical narrative like papyri, payment receipts, the Maccabees, the Jubilees, the Egyptian Elephantine exiled communities, the Samaritans, and so on. So these are very well testified to. From Babylon to Moses, we have to rely primarily on the Bible as the main source of evidence. And the Bible presents a continuous narrative. Later historical sources like Philo or Josephus or the Book of Jubilees confirm that the Jews themselves interpreted the continuous narrative of the Bible as continuous. In other words, there's no discontinuity, if I can use that word, between what the Jews themselves perceived and interpreted and hermeneutically ascertained, exegeted from the biblical record and what the Bible itself said. They both testify to a continuous record of the 7-day week. The issue was not that people lost track of these days, but rather the issue is that they knew and still chose otherwise. It was a hardness of heart. They refused, they apostatized, and they didn't keep the Sabbath. Now, from Moses to Adam. That's a very important link also. We assume that when God reminded Israel of the Sabbath in the wilderness, that it was the actual seventh day, and God basically timed everything perfectly. That makes sense, knowing who God is, as completely omniscient, omnipotent, he's sovereign, he's 100% consistent, he's very particular about the Sabbath. It makes sense. It also aligns with the historical and biblical records that we covered very nicely and neatly. However, the Bible is also very consistent and insistent, very clear, that this pattern continued through each successive covenant after Adam. And that's a very important point to remember. I've talked about this in my Sabbath series, chapter 3, episode 3, Should Christians Keep the Sabbath? I'm going to reiterate the points here so that you have them for yourself and you can see for yourself. With Noah, Noah is the first covenant situation after Adam, and we know that Noah kept the 7-day pattern. Genesis 6, verse 18, "But I will establish my covenant with you. And you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons and wives with you." Okay, so there's a covenant being established. Genesis 7, 1 through 5. "Then Yahweh said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." This is an important point. Noah was righteous, and in context, we know that keeping the Sabbath is very important to God and finding rest in God. So this is a very important statement. It doesn't explicitly say that Noah kept the Sabbath, but you'll see later that he did. Verse 2, "Take with you 7 pairs of clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of the earth. For in 7 days, 7 days." So when is God talking to Noah? He's talking to Noah on the first day of the week. "In 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." This is interesting because, again, you'll see in the Exodus timeline, when God appears on the mountain in fire and fury and wrath, that's on the Sabbath, and then the 40 days begins after that. It's the same similar timelines of like the Sabbath happening, and then there's like a 40-day thing happening, then another Sabbath and another 40-day thing happens. It's very interesting that this is a parallel. "And Noah did all that Yahweh had commanded him." So Noah was obedient, and he was righteous before God, and God is using the 7-day pattern with Noah. So that's really interesting. One more, Genesis 8, verse 9 through 12. "But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days." So there was a 7-day period, and then there's another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. "And the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him anymore." So it is very clear that Noah waits for 7 days, twice at least, because they reckoned according to the creation week. There is zero reason to arbitrarily wait 7-day periods, unless you have an interruption in those periods to define that as a weekly unit. Where would you get that interruption from? Well, you would get it from creation. and that knowledge was passed down, and Noah was righteous and obeyed everything that God told him to do, so very likely Noah kept the Sabbath. God is very deliberate, and he created the Sabbath as a picture of the gospel that was first given to mankind as a wedding gift, where mankind enters God's rest after being created. After the fall, that information was largely forgotten by mankind because everybody became corrupted. Although you still had a lineage of faithful people like Enoch, like the people that weren't corrupting themselves. The Bible doesn't document that extensively, but they were there. It's not clear immediately from the text if this was handed down by Seth's lineage through various righteous people, Enoch, and then eventually to Noah. It's not clear. Or if God reminded Noah as part of the covenant at some point, and Noah was grafted back in to that pattern. The Bible says that Noah was righteous, so I believe that Noah was likely keeping the Sabbath as his forefathers were instructing him to. I believe that the Sabbath was passed down through Adam and various successive generations, and Noah, as a picture of Christ and being righteous in God's eyes, was keeping the Sabbath. Either way, the Sabbath, you can see, is very much tied to judgment, to the gospel, to the covenant that they were having every time. There's same themes. Very, very important. Now, the next important covenant after that is Abraham. Abraham was about 1,000 years after Noah, if you use the correct Septuagint ages of the patriarchs, not the corrupted Masoretic ones. The Bible is not an itemized description of everything that happens under the sun, but we can infer truth using good hermeneutics and cross-referencing the Bible with itself. Very clearly, it does not explicitly state that Abraham kept the Sabbath. Very important. But that doesn't mean that Abraham did not keep the Sabbath. Adam kept the Sabbath and had a covenant with God. Noah kept the Sabbath and had a covenant with God. Moses kept the Sabbath and had a covenant with God. So, if Abraham is in there as the covenant between Noah and Moses, is it likely that Abraham was reminded of this practice also as his part of his contact with God and having a covenant and being that representative for humanity, basically, that's basically the representative of the covenant, like Adam? Is it possible that he was reminded of this practice and grafted back in? Is it possible? Well, I would think it's very possible, actually, considering that the other ones were doing so. Genesis 26, verse 4 through 5. Now, this is speaking to Isaac. Yeah, God's promise to Isaac. So God is with Isaac every step of the way. He's saying, listen, I'm going to be with you as I was with your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your offspring all of these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. He obeyed, he kept his charge, he kept my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. This is a very absolute hyperbole, right? In other words, like Abraham obeyed everything I asked him to do. There's no hint in this statement that Abraham was like kind of disobedient. Abraham obeyed everything God asked him to do. Okay? The language there also includes commandments, statutes, and laws. All right? Very, very important. In the Septuagint, if you read it, let's go to Septuagint. It says, my commandments and my ordinances. That's an interesting word, ordinances, and my statutes. So, that's very interesting. That's testimony from God himself that Abraham was very obedient. Just like, hey, Noah, you're obedient, you're righteous in my eyes. Okay, let's see. Well, notice the words, commandments, statutes, and laws. Did God give Abraham any tablets or books of the law or anything like that? No, he gave him circumcision, but what else? Not really a big record of laws or anything else. So that means that Abraham was obedient, and whatever God had asked him to do, he was obeying. But there's no laundry list of laws and commandments that we see God giving to Abraham. But we do know that the Sabbath is one of God's eternal laws and principles and statutes and ordinances and commands. So God says that Abraham kept his laws and statutes and commandments. If we go to Exodus 16 now, where the reintegration of Israel comes back to the creation week, we see the issue of not keeping the Sabbath, because on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. So they're breaking the Sabbath. Now, God responds saying, and Yahweh said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? Let's see what the Septuagint has to say, just out of curiosity. How long are you unwilling to hearken to my commands and my law? So it's the same or similar, very, very similar language to Genesis 26. So the Sabbath breaking, again, this is before Mount Sinai, so you can't claim that it's a ceremonial law. The Sabbath breaking is explicitly referred to as a commandment and a law. Abraham kept all of God's commandments and laws. Every other covenant outside of Abraham, which was a covenant also, was associated with the Sabbath and rest. Adam, Noah, Moses, etc. Abraham was in between these. He kept all the commandments and laws. Simple deduction is that Abraham kept the Sabbath, if you're just honest with the text. The Sabbath is one of the 10 Commandments and one of the major themes of the Old Testament. Very major themes that can't be denied. The Sabbath is also tied to every covenant relationship that God has. Why? Because the Sabbath is a picture of the gospel. The Sabbath is referred to by God as a commandment and a law explicitly. God says that Abraham kept his commandments and laws. Abraham had a covenant with God. God does not change and is 100% consistent. Therefore, Abraham kept the Sabbath, even though the Bible does not explicitly say Abraham rested on the seventh day. Abraham kept the Sabbath. This means there is a 100% continuity, my friends. A beautiful thing from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses to Jesus and beyond. Because after Jesus, again, there's continuity through Constantine, from Constantine to Pope Gregory, and then from Gregory to the modern day. We have a complete continuity of thousands of years. God has preserved this truth. Why? Because it is foundational to the gospel. It also proves that he's sovereign over time and history. All the covenants involved the Sabbath. Adam rested, Noah rested, Abraham rested, Moses rested, and Jesus rested. All of them involve the Sabbath. God preserved the seventh-day sequence throughout time so that it would never be changed. However, big asterisk, God also allowed pagan powers to do damage and run wild and compromise to happen, because this is a test. And why the Sabbath alone, out of all of the commands, begins with the word remember, because it will be forgotten. Not because the order of the days will be forgotten, but you will forget. And all of the upheavals and compromises and convergences of cultures with the truth, you're going to forget. You're going to forget to keep the Sabbath, or eventually you might think that keeping another day, like the Pope tells you, is a good idea. This is why you must remember. Now, with all that said, there's a few challenges, and the first challenge is Daniel 7, verse 25. He shall speak words against the Most High, this is a little horn, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and he shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times half a time. So, part of the eschatology of the Bible is that the Antichrist power is going to affect the times and the law. Of course, God's law, God's moral law. I've talked about these things many times in several places, so go refer to those various eschatological series. I do not believe this has to do with the continuity of days. It doesn't invalidate anything that we've talked about. And neither would the Jews believe that, because none of them interpreted this way also. The word for times in the original language is zaman. It's not moedim. Moedim is like divinely appointed celebrations or divinely appointed times. Zaman is like seasons. He would think to change the times, the seasons. This is fulfilled in many ways without compromising on everything that we've just looked at. The papacy stamping its name on the calendar with the Gregorian calendar. That's the calendar that we use. It's named after one of the Antichrist men. Changing the order of the Ten Commandments, changing the interpretation of the Sabbath to Sunday, also having their own religious calendar and festival calendar, having various stupid holidays that we do throughout time, even changing the seasons themselves. Because we have 4 seasons, where actually, if you look in the original calendar that God gave the Israelites, there's only 2 seasons. There's the cold season and the warm season. Up and down, left and right, male and female, yin and yang. This is God's design, okay? This is the dance of life. You don't have 4 seasons, folks. You actually have 2 seasons. So If you like fall, sorry to burst your bubble. I like fall too, but they're just warm season and cold season. So either way, these things of changing the times and the laws are fulfilled without calling into question the sequence of the week. That's important. This is the fine line and the narrow road of how to navigate this issue. The fulfillment of Daniel 7:25 is fulfilled in many ways without compromising the sequence of the week that is ongoing through time. God decreed that there would be changes to various calendars, upheavals, compromises, convergences, but underneath, he preserved the truth. God, for example, God decreed that there would be people like the Jews to do violence to the text and create the Masoretic text. Or Westcott and Hort with the New Testament, which a lot of KJV people are frothing at the mouth against. Although I'll tell you what, the KJV uses the Masoretic text, and Westcott and Hort are little tiny babies compared to what the Jews did to the Masoretic text, to the Old Testament. So there's that. Anyway, the point is that God decreed these things would happen, that people would mess with his word. But you know what? You can pick up any version of the Bible most of the time, unless it's like the Passion or something. I don't even consider that a translation. But you can get any translation that's an actual official translation, and you can discern how to be saved, who God is, what's going to happen. You can discern that. God has preserved the meaning of his word. Certain things are challenging, and you have to resolve those with a lot of in-depth studies. But the Bible is not made for theologians. Okay, it's not made for historians. It's made for the average person to read and to have a supernatural experience of the Holy Spirit and to repent and believe. And that's been preserved, despite all of these nefarious people changing things. And, like the KJV has a lot of connections to, Francis Bacon and Freemasonry. And so there's shenanigans everywhere you look, folks. There's always shenanigans. And yet, those shenanigans are allowed to exist so that you can see that God preserves his word and he's totally sovereign, which is phenomenal. The same is with this calendar issue and the continuation of the weeks. There are many things that have happened, but God has preserved underneath that the record of the 7-day week over and over again. He preserved the eternal, unending sequence that ties him to creation and to redemption, because the seventh day is the seventh day God rested, which is a fact of history, which created the world. It is based on what God did. Do you get it? It's not just an arbitrary organization of the days. The seventh day is when God rested, and the other 6 days is when he created the earth. What he did determined the sequence of reality. And then, of course, that sequence was fulfilled with Jesus when Jesus rested in the tomb on the seventh day, which is a fact of history. All so in alignment and perfectly timed, which is a profound thought. God preserved the timeless message of Scripture for us to know what he wants and who he is. He preserved historical knowledge, enough, not everything, but enough to validate that his word is true and what the Bible says about various things like the end of times or even the Sabbath issue that we're talking about today, that the Sabbath has been continuous. We have historical proof that this is the case. So this is not a challenge with Daniel 7 verse 25 with changing times and laws. It's not a challenge at all. The issue is knowing that this is the true seventh day and yet still refusing to rest on it despite the evidence presented to you. That's the real issue, my friends. It's not about calling into question God's sovereignty or whether he's lost track of time or we can't know the seventh day. Yes, we can. When you rest on Saturday, you can call it whatever day you want. I call it Sabbath day. When you rest on the seventh day, you're actually resting on the real seventh day based on the original sequence of creation. Second challenge, and this is our last challenge, but it's the ISO 8601 calendar and also Europe and China and Islam. I've lumped all of these together into one thing because they're all kind of related. ISO 8601 is a standardized reckoning system where Monday is day 1 and Sunday is day 7. Europe often puts Monday as the first day of the week, so Sunday looks like the 7th day over there. Chinese names the day of the week also this way, like Monday is the first day of the week. Islam has its own day of worship on Friday, which, of course, that confounds things because they perceive, although their words testify that the order of the days of the week is still the same as everybody else, they perceive the week beginning with Saturday. Do you get it? Where Friday is the day of worship, and then Saturday begins. So how do you reckon? How do we deal with all these situations, and how are they going to be integrated into the mark of the beast? That's a real important question. So let's understand. ISO 8601 is an international standard covering the worldwide exchange and communication of date and time related data. It is maintained by the International Organization for Standardization, which is ISO, and was first published in 1988, with updates in 1991, 2000, 2004, 2019, and an amendment in 2022. Very interesting that they're doing these regular updates. Please keep that in mind, because I believe that this will eventually be updated to match the Christian revival that is taking the world. Keep that in mind, because right now we're very secular with this. The standard provides a well-defined, unambiguous method of representing calendar dates and times in worldwide communications, especially to avoid misinterpreting numeric dates and times when such data is transferred between countries with different conventions for writing numeric dates and times. So it's an attempt to get the world on a world calendar. This is a secular issue, but you know that the powers that rule this world use proxies and organizations to do their bidding. And we know that the world has to get on a universal calendar in order for all of this to be glorifying the day of, basically the devil's rest day and obeying the word of the pontiff. So all of these things are just dialectics that one day are going to align very harmoniously for the beast. But keep in mind what this is. So there's that. There's also this, which if you look up week in Wikipedia, you have this issue where, here's the world. Supposedly, this is not the actual shape of the earth, but different places have different usages of the first day of the week. So the places in blue are using the normal day, the Constantinian day, which is Sunday is the first day of the week, which really it's not the Constantinian day. It's the day that's always been the first day of the week that happened to converge with the planetary week of Sunday being the first day. But this has been the first day of the week. This is where these places are where the calendar is represented accurately, and you have Sunday as the first day of the week. Like if you pull up your calendar, it should say Sunday first if you're in the United States. And other places like Russia, Europe, and so on, someplace, they use this ISO secular system where it's more oriented around the work days, where the work week begins on Monday, which even in itself, the work week is influenced by Sunday keeping. Do you get it? Because nobody worked on Sunday, so Monday is the first day of the week, so now we're going to do it that way. So it's still influenced by the beast. Either way, this is parts of the world. Okay, so you have a dialectic. You have two things, king of the north, king of the south. You see it? Very interesting, isn't it? Then, of course, you have the Muslims with their own way of keeping track of things, but Muslims themselves, you'll see it's very convoluted, okay? It's very convoluted. With Islam, despite the fact that they're worshiping on Friday and they perceive the week to begin on Saturday in the sense that counting down to the next day of worship, right? 6 days. Their wording for this is the simple ways to learn the days of the week in Arabic. So you look at the words here and here we go. The first 2 days are unique in their significance. Friday, Al-Jamula, Al-Juma, whatever this day holds religious importance in Islam. Friday is the day of congregational prayer for Muslims. The word Jamua refers to gathering a congregation. Saturday, Sabbath. Sabbath. The word Sabbath means rest, drawing connections to ancient traditions where the seventh day was the day of rest. So they label the days the same. The Sabbath is still the Sabbath in Arabic. Do you get it? The Sabbath is still the Sabbath day. They call these days different names, but the Sabbath day has been preserved in Arabic, and it aligns with the Roman day of Saturday, or the actual day of the Sabbath day. Sunday, the word al-Ahad translates to the first or one, signifying that it was the first day of the week. Monday comes from the number 2, marking it as the second day of the week. Tuesday, derived from 3, etc., etc. So the Arabic words for the days of the week actually testify to the fact that they're on the same calendar. In fact, if I go back to you, can I click on you? I can't. Oh my gosh, so annoying. All right. If you're going to be stubborn, then let's do this. Let's copy you and click a roof. If we go back to this, So you see, the Muslims, even though they have their own way of worship, Muslims are going to be converted. Don't worry about that. They're really in alignment with the blue zones. Okay, so really you just have two. You have two. You have the religious Christian way of reckoning, where Sunday is first and preeminent, and that's the first day of the week. And then you have the secular way of reckoning, where Monday, we got to go with the working day, and it's all about work. Do you see the dialectic? And as people are going to come into this reality, and Catholic social teaching and rerum novarum, and respect for the worker is going to come in place, we have to find respect for, people to rest. And so we got to start the week with rest and elevate that rather than starting with work and focusing on these secular things. So I fully anticipate this dialectic to resolve in the coming 5-10 years max, not even less than that. So Islam already has the days named after the actual order that aligns already with the Christian calendar, the Christian naming of the days. So they're not off. It's just the fact that they worship on Friday, and they culturally perceive that worship week as slightly different, obviously because of the fact they worship on Friday. But their naming conventions are still the same. The same is with China, Europe, and the ISO 8601. The ISO 8601 is a relatively recent invention, 1988, and again, it's secular, King of the South. It was brought into being because of the work week being from Monday through Friday, which again is influenced by the Christian week because the Western world was resting on Sunday. Remember, historically, at first, people kept both days holy. Well, at first, people kept the Sabbath only, and they worked on Sunday. Then eventually, they kept Sunday as a day of rest following Constantine, and that promulgated throughout the Roman Empire. After about 1000 AD, that became a real standard. But up until even 1000 AD, people were keeping both days holy and resting on both days. So they were keeping both days, and then eventually it was just Sunday, especially as Rome's demonization of people who kept the Sabbath was going out into the world. Of course, you had pockets of people, but nevertheless, most of Christendom was keeping Sunday after 1000 AD, after the Great Schism. You also had eventually, with the Industrial Revolution, 19th, 20th centuries, the practice of the weekend coming into being. So these cultural changes, the Christendom, the fact that people eventually kept Sunday, eventually had the weekend, the industrialization, modernization, eventually you had the labeling of the work week having to be necessitated to be from Monday to Friday, because everybody was working Monday through Friday. So this calendar, this ISO 8601, was created to just label the week starting from Monday to make it basically more convenient for business exchanges and records or whatever else. It doesn't change the order of the days. It doesn't change the order of the days. It just like the planetary representations on the stick calendars that we looked at. All it does is just change how the order is represented. Again, the sequence is always going to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? You could start with Tuesday, you could start with Saturday, you could start with Wednesday, whatever day you start with, doesn't matter. That day hasn't changed. Do you get it? It's how you're choosing to represent it on a calendar. You could start with Saturday, you could start with Sunday. Of course, most places start with Sunday because that's the actual first day of the week, based on the creation pattern. And the fact that the creation pattern converged with the planetary week naming pattern. So Sunday, being the first day of the week, is actually the first day of creation according to the sequence. And that's why the calendars in the Christian world represent it that way. But there's a lot of secular places and other places that were normalized using this secular calendar that represents the first day of the week. Not that it changed the order of the days, but it just represents it as Monday because that's when the work week starts. So ISO 8601 does not change the order or the number of the days, like making Monday the first day of the week instead of Sunday. That's not what's happening. It's a naming convention, just like the Chinese names are naming conventions. ISO 8601 also works off the Gregorian calendar, so nothing has changed. This is still the beast system. But again, remember that the beast system converged with the creation week. So we're still able to keep the right days. because God has preserved that. But nevertheless, important to understand that communist China is secular and is very oriented around work. So they're very prone to keep that kind of calendar for now. Europe also has been very secular, hence the success of this naming system. But these things are very similar to how Jews and Christians were keeping their calendar alongside, parallel to the pagan naming convention that was around them, and eventually they fused. So, with all that said, I want you now that we've covered all this history to understand going forward history repeating. Because as I studied this, I said, I see something very interesting happening. I always wondered, how are they going to get everybody on a universal world clock, a universal system? Something has to happen with this reckoning, because everybody's reckoning differently. You've got the Christian world, or at least, a lot of places reckoning with Sunday as the first day of the week. And these other places are representing the week with Monday, although it doesn't change the order of the days. They're just happening to represent the week that way. So how does this work? There has to be some universality to it. After studying history and after studying these things to present to you, it became clear to me that history is going to repeat. And it's going to repeat in a very simple way. Islam already has the labels for the days, so they're not off. And all they need is just to be converted. Do you get it? The Islamic Arabic words are already in alignment with the order of the creation week. They're labeling the days correctly. The problem is that Islam has a day of worship on Friday. And it's not Saturday, it's not Sunday. But if you can convert Islam, and you can turn Islam into Catholicism, and they switch their day of worship to Sunday, then all of that is going to align perfectly. The naming convention of their Arabic words and the cultural perception of the week are going to superimpose on each other, and Islam will have unity. Because right now it has disunity. You understand? And this disunity is, of course, is a dialectic designed by the devil, because this disunity creates friction. The spiritual week is perceived from, Saturday to Friday, but the actual week, according to their own Arabic words, is like everybody else. So Islam needs to be converted. They will be converted. I've talked about this many times. There's more people leaving Islam now in the last, 25 years than there have been in the last, 1,400 years of Islam's history. So Islam is going to collapse. China, Europe, everywhere else that they're a little more secular and using these secular systems, they're going to collapse also, because the Christian revival is going to go across the entire world. Everybody's going to become quote unquote Christian. And that's going to reorient perception of how the week is structured, especially with the coming Catholic social teaching Rerum Novarum Foundation for labor, for rest, for Sunday sacredness. All of this is going to come into the world, my friends, which is going to influence cultural perception. It's going to influence cultural perception of how to represent the calendar in your phone, on walls, whatever else. China has a massive Catholic and Christian underground population that is poised for a major revival because of the oppressive failures of the CCP. They're poised for a major revival in China. And that'll be something, because the infrastructure is already there for the image of the beast. So very, very interesting situation. Europe also is very secular. It was, but now it's having its own revival moment. And you have the European Sunday Alliance and all these other leapfrog organizations that are very much laboring very hard to bring back Sunday sacredness and Sunday legislations and so on. Even if the labeling systems do not change to get total uniformity between, how the days are displayed between, like, let's say, Europe and the United States, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Even if this doesn't change, the order of the days has not changed. The order of the days has not changed. When the revival sweeps the world, Sunday is going to be elevated to prominence across the resurrected Roman Empire, so to speak. Just like Constantine decreed his empire-wide Sunday rest law, which eventually solidified the union of the planetary week and the Christian week. Do you get it? So too will the last pontifex, the final iteration of the man of sin, decree his empire-wide image of the beast Sunday rest law, unifying the world system around one day of worship and collapsing the secular way of reckoning with the existing Jewish Christian creation week pattern. And again, you're going to see history repeating itself. The tension between the current secular week, which is Monday through Sunday, and the Christian week, where Sunday is prominent and displayed first, is very similar in my mind to the planetary week tension in the 4th century with the Christian and Jewish creation week. A lot of similar tensions. And eventually that tension just resolved by convergence. You get it? Nothing changed as far as the order of the days, but there was a convergence. And so I see that happening again. They have these little updates with their ISO thing. I could see this happening in 2029 or whatever. Oh, there's a new update. We've decided to become honoring God with our representation of the calendar so that Sunday becomes preeminent throughout the world and reckoning. Why? Because now people are going to remember Sunday rest, Sunday rest, Sunday rest. So it has to reflect in the calendars, folks. It has to. I said a while ago that they will have to get people on a common perception of time. And I didn't realize it until now, studying deeper history of how these two systems converged, that this is exactly what's going to happen with this ISO 8601. You have the King of the South system and you have the King of the North system that gives Sunday preeminence. And that'll be something to watch. These are very interesting parallels, I think. Either way, this is not an issue, nor are the days actually numbered differently in other countries. The problem is just how they're displayed. What's the order that they're displayed? It doesn't change the order of the days when it's Sunday evening in Japan. It's, I don't know what, Monday morning in somewhere else, right? So the order is still the same, where everybody's on the same clock. The order of the days is not different. It's how they're displayed. And how they're displayed puts emphasis in a particular direction. The ISO secular King of the South 8601 system makes Monday the first day of the week. And, the emphasis is on work. Because that was the point. It was business and work. But as this new system is coming to life, it's going to give Sunday preeminence. And it's going to converge these things with the creation week calendar, which of course is Sunday as the first day of the week. So either way, the point is Sunday is the first day of the week. Saturday is the seventh day of the week. Even if Sunday is displayed as the 7th day on your calendar, like if you're in China or Australia or Europe or whatever, it doesn't mean that Sunday is actually the 7th day. So for people who are having trouble with this and saying, well, in my place it shows Sunday as the 7th day. Well, Sunday is not the 7th day. It's not. So you got to rest on Saturday. Even though that may be represented differently where you're living, Saturday is still the 7th day. And it always was, and it always will be. I believe as revival will sweep the world and the King of the South is finally destroyed, people are going to push for a unified display of the world calendar. ISO 8601 is going to be abolished, or it's going to be changed, and they're going to have a Christian version. It's going to be a dark to light kind of moment, so this is something to watch. So we have to pay attention to these things. But it'll be very interesting. The current standard is secular, so I think they're going to create a Christian one that honors Sunday and makes people think about Sunday rest. America already uses this calendar, and America's the one that deceives the world into the final system. So it stands to reason that the world will end up with America's naming convention. You get it? America is the false prophet, deceiving the world into this final system, this resurrected Roman Empire thing. And that system is going to be based on what America is doing. America is proclaiming the planetary week as it is, with Sunday being the first day of the week. So that means that the world calendar will have to be standardized in order to fully cement the spiritual delusion in people's minds. Something to think about. So don't worry. God is not going to let you be deceived. It's abundantly clear what the beast wants and what he will do to enforce worship. You are not going to be confused about which day it is or whatever. Don't be afraid of that. Especially as time moves forward, I think it's going to be very, very obvious. So don't despair, but rather see that all of this confirms God's word and confirms God's sovereignty too. When you rest on the 7th day, you are honoring the pattern set down at creation and fulfilled at redemption. Also, when you rest on the 7th day, you are anticipating the last day of creation, which is the final 7th day of history, when Jesus returns, I believe, on a Sabbath. So the Sabbath is very meaningful, and especially because there's complete continuation between today and, the first week, I think that makes it even more meaningful. Saturday is the secular pagan name for us, but, we use it as a naming convention, but for us, it's the Sabbath day. And that's what you have to think. It's the Sabbath day. Every other day is just a relationship to the Sabbath day. The first day of the Sabbath, the second day of the Sabbath, and so on and so forth. We are in the world, but we are not of the world. We use these naming conventions, but we are set apart in our minds. We're set apart. We don't participate in their idolatry. So I hope this was interesting. It was quite the adventure for me to put this together for you. Certainly learned a little more on this issue. As always, it's always a pleasure and fun to dig deeper and deeper into something that you thought you knew, but of course is very nuanced. And when you're dealing with history, when you're dealing with early church history, calendars, timing conventions, it can be quite the goose chase because there's a lot to research. Make sure you share this video with your friends and keep your eyes out on the historical developments with the issues discussed, and email them to me. You can email me at tudor@danceoflife.com with said issues if you find anything good. But like I said, I anticipate very well and fully that this whole secular ISO 8601 thing is going to have a dark to light moment within the next, 5 to 7 years. So that'll be an interesting time. When that happens, you know that the time is near. We'll see you. Until next time, take care and God bless.